Thank you for joining in today's cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Maiden-Voice, and this is a horror story about the Parthenope. And in this story, during a routine renovation of a historic palazzo in Naples, workers breach a sealed, brine-filled limestone chamber that dates back to the pre-Roman era. They find an ancient, avian-shaped fossilized remain entwined with gold jewelry. The artifact is removed, but the seal is broken, releasing a dormant, ancestral hunger. The second story today is called The Echo in the Silt, and this is a horror story about the Kushtaka. And in this story, a group of 5 urban explorers hikers travel to a remote part of the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. They are looking for a lost cannery settlement from the early 1900s. They encounter a local guide who refuses to take them past a certain creek. While camping, they see an otter on the bank. It stands on its hind legs and watches them with eyes that have pupils too vertical to be animal, but too wide to be human. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped. Also, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss the stories yet to come. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Maiden-Voice. The medical examiner's name was Dr. Luca Ferraro, and he had performed autopsies in Naples for 19 years. And in those 19 years, he had seen the dead in every configuration the dead could assume. Drowned, burned, crushed, perforated, decomposed, dismembered, and on one memorable occasion, mummified in the cavity behind a bathroom wall in an apartment in the quartiere Spagnoli, where the tenant had been dead for 11 months before anyone noticed the smell. Dr. Ferraro was not a man who was easily surprised. He had attended medical school at Federico II, the oldest university in Europe, and he had been trained in the tradition of Neapolitan medicine, which was a tradition that combined scientific rigor with a particular, hard-won fatalism. The understanding that the human body in this city was capable of dying in ways that the textbooks had not yet imagined. But the fisherman on the table in front of him was something new. The man's name was Salvatore Esposito, age 54, occupation fisherman, found dead in the bedroom of his apartment on Via Toledo at 6:47 a.m. by his wife, who had woken to find him cold and stiff and staring at the ceiling with an expression that she described to the police as surprised, like he recognized someone. There was no sign of forced entry. No sign of struggle. No sign of foul play, except for the fact that Salvatore Esposito was dead, and the manner of his death was, in Dr. Ferraro's professional opinion, impossible. The lungs were the first anomaly. When Ferraro opened the chest cavity, he found the lungs fully inflated, not with air but with salt water, seawater, the Mediterranean specifically. The salinity, the mineral content, the particular chemical signature of the Tyrrhenian Sea, which Ferraro knew because he had, in a previous life, considered a career in marine biology before the dead had called to him more strongly than the living. The lungs were filled with seawater to the point of complete saturation, the alveoli burst, the tissue waterlogged, the weight of the lungs nearly triple what they should have been. Salvatore Esposito had drowned. He had drowned in his own bed, in a dry room, on the 4th floor of an apartment building in the center of Naples, 3 kilometers from the sea and 40 meters above sea level. But the lungs were not the worst part. The vocal cords were gone. Not cut, not removed with a blade which would have left a clean incision, a margin, a surgical signature. Not torn, not ripped out by force, which would have left ragged tissue, hemorrhage, the evidence of violence. The vocal cords had been plucked, removed from the larynx with a precision that was not surgical but biological, as though something had reached into the man's throat and extracted the vocal cords the way a bird extracts a worm from the ground, with a specialized instrument, evolved for exactly this purpose, designed for the specific act of removing one thing from another thing without damaging the surrounding tissue. The larynx was otherwise intact. The epiglottis, the trachea, the bronchi, all undisturbed. Only the vocal cords were missing, and the cavity where they had been was clean, almost surgical. the edges of the wound sealed not with blood but with a thin, translucent film that Ferraro did not recognize and that, when he touched it with his scalpel, vibrated. The tissue vibrated, not mechanically, not the way a tuning fork vibrates when struck, but biologically with a low, sustained hum that Ferraro felt in his fingertips and in the metal of the scalpel, and that traveled up his arm and settled in his inner ear. A frequency that was not a sound but a sensation, a pressure, a vibration that his body recognized even if his mind did not. It was the vibration of vocal cords. Of vocal cords that were not in the room but that were, in some way that Dr. Ferraro's 19 years of medical training had not prepared him to understand, still connected to the wound, still resonating with the frequency of the voice they had once produced. Salvatore Esposito's voice was still in the room. It was vibrating in the thin, translucent film that sealed the wound in his throat, and it was humming, and the hum was not random. It was a melody. A simple, descending melody, 3 notes repeated, the kind of melody that a mother sings to a child or that a lover sings to a beloved, a melody that was ancient and universal, and that Dr. Luca Ferraro, standing in the autopsy suite with his scalpel and his gloves and his 19 years of impossible dead, could not identify and could not stop hearing. He sealed the body, filed the report, and went home, and that night, for the first time in his career, Dr. Luca Ferraro dreamed of the sea. The excavation of the Palazzo Donnergina began as a routine renovation and became, within 72 hours, the most significant archaeological discovery in Naples since the unearthing of the Greek-Roman city beneath the modern streets. The Palazzo was a 16th-century building on Via Donnergina, in the neighborhood that had been, in antiquity, the heart of the original Greek colony of Naples. The new city that had been founded by settlers from Cumae, who had themselves been founded by settlers from the island of Euboea, who had brought with them, in the holds of their triremes, the gods and the myths and the monsters of the old world. The renovation was funded by the city, which had purchased the palazzo with the intention of converting it into a museum of Neapolitan underground history, and the work had been progressing smoothly until the 3rd day, when the workmen broke through a wall in the basement and found, behind the wall, a chamber. The chamber was not on any map. It was not Roman, it was not Greek, and it was not Neapolitan. It was older, pre-Roman, pre-Greek, older than the city itself, carved into the limestone bedrock by hands that predated the alphabet and possibly the wheel. It was small, perhaps 3 meters in diameter, and it was filled, floor to ceiling, with brine, not water, brine. A dense, saturated salt solution that had been sealed in the chamber for millennia, its mineral content so high that it had preserved everything within it with the fidelity of a formaldehyde tank. The brine was the temperature of the deep sea, cold, 8 degrees Celsius, and it was the color of milk, opaque with dissolved minerals and with the particulate of whatever was suspended in it. The workmen drained the chamber using a portable pump, and as the brine receded, what it revealed was not a room but a tomb. The chamber was a burial chamber, and at its center, lying on a bier of carved limestone, was a body. But it was not a human body, or it was, partially, the way a centaur is partially a horse. The remains were fossilized, mineralized by the brine, the organic tissue replaced over millennia by a process of mineral deposition that had turned bone to stone and flesh to crystal, and the fossil was avian. Large, much larger than any living bird, with a wingspan that had been, in life, perhaps 4 meters, and a body that was not the sleek, aerodynamic body of a flying bird, but the heavy, powerful body of a terrestrial predator. A running bird, a hunting bird, the kind of bird that had evolved on islands where there were no mammalian predators, and where birds filled the ecological niches that mammals filled elsewhere. The head was enormous, the beak hooked and powerful, the legs thick and scaled, and the talons, 3 forward, 1 back, each the length of a dinner fork, were still sharp after 3,000 years in brine. But the body was not entirely avian. The upper torso, the chest, the shoulders, the neck, the lower face was human, or had been human. The mineralized remains showed the structure of a woman's torso, the clavicles, the ribcage, the mandible, and the mandible was the mandible of a woman, delicate and angled, with teeth that were not the flat, grinding teeth of a herbivore but the sharp, pointed teeth of something that had evolved, or had been designed, to eat meat. The face above the mandible was gone, eroded by the brine, or deliberately removed before burial. But the body below the face was a chimera, a hybrid, the upper body of a woman grafted onto the lower body of a predatory bird, and the graft was not surgical. It was seamless. The tissue transitioned from human to avian without a scar, without a seam, without a boundary, as though the body had been grown this way, as though it had been born this way, as though this was not a composite of two species but a single species, a species that had gone extinct, or that had been sealed in a brine-filled chamber beneath the streets of Naples, or that had been buried here in this place, in this city, because this was the place where the land met the sea and the sea was where it lived. And around the neck of the fossil, threaded through the mineralized vertebrae, was a chain of gold. The gold was not fossilized. It was pristine, untouched by the brine, the links still flexible, the metal still bright, and at the end of the chain, resting on the bier beside the fossil's collarbone, was a pendant. The pendant was a disc of gold, perhaps 5 centimeters in diameter, and on the disc was engraved an image. A woman's face, surrounded by hair that was not hair but feathers, and below the face the body of a bird. The foreman called the archaeological superintendent. The superintendent called the police called the mayor, and the mayor, who had been looking for a publicity opportunity that would justify the palazzo renovation budget, called the press. By the end of the day, the fossil was out of the chamber. It had been lifted from the bier, wrapped in protective material, and transported to the National Archaeological Museum of Naples, where it was installed in a climate-controlled display case in the Greek Antiquities wing. The gold pendant was separated from the fossil, against the protests of the archaeologists, who argued that the pendant was part of the burial context and should not be removed, and placed in the museum's vault for authentication and cataloging. The chamber was empty, the brine was gone, the seal was broken. And something, released from the chamber by the removal of the body and the draining of the brine, began to stir in the dark beneath the city. The first reports came 3 days later. They did not come to the police, or to the newspapers, or to any official channel. They came to the hospitals, and they came as symptoms, not events. People arriving at emergency rooms across Naples complaining of a sound. Not an external sound, not a noise in the environment, not something that could be recorded or measured, but an internal sound, a hum, a vibration in the ears that was not tinnitus because tinnitus is a constant tone and this was not constant. It was a melody. 3 notes descending, repeated. The same 3 notes that Dr. Ferraro had heard in the autopsy suite, vibrating in the translucent film that sealed Salvatore Esposito's throat. The same melody that had been described in the medical literature of the previous century as the siren song, a term that the doctors in the emergency rooms used not because they believed in sirens, but because it was the only word that fit, the only term that captured the quality of the sound, which was not merely auditory but compulsive, not merely heard but felt, not merely perceived but obeyed. The people who heard the melody were drawn to water, not to the sea, that came later, but to any water, the fountains in the piazzas, the taps in their kitchens, the water in their toilets. They stood at the sinks and let the water run over their hands and stared at it with the fixed, rapt expression of people who are listening to something that no one else can hear. They were not violent. They were not distressed. They were, in the words of one doctor, peaceful in a way that is itself distressing. The peace of people who have been given an instruction by a voice that they trust implicitly, a voice that they recognize, a voice that they cannot disobey because it is not an external command but an internal imperative, a biological directive that bypasses the conscious mind and speaks directly to the body. And then the humming began to move. The pattern was not immediately obvious. The reports came from different parts of the city, the quartiere Spagnoli first, then the area around the port, then the historic center, then the neighborhoods along the coast, and they moved in a specific direction. Inland. From the coast toward the interior, following a path that, if you plotted it on a map, traced the ancient coastline of the city. Not the modern coastline, which had been extended by land reclamation and development, but the original coastline, the coastline of the Greek colony of Naples, the coastline that had existed when the city was first founded, 3,000 years ago, on a promontory of limestone that jutted into the Tyrrhenian Sea. The city had grown outward from that original coastline, building on land that had once been seabed, burying the ancient shore beneath layers of Roman and medieval and modern construction. But the coastline was still there beneath the streets and the aqueducts that ran beneath the city, the ancient Greek cuniculi, the Roman aqueducts, the Bourbon tunnels, followed the same paths, the same contours, the same routes from the coast to the interior. The water had carved the paths, and the city had built on top of them, and the thing that had been released from the chamber was following the water, moving inland through the subterranean tunnels, surfacing through the drains and the wells and the fountains, reaching up through the infrastructure of the city, and finding the people who lived above it, and calling to them with a melody that they could not resist. The first death that was not Salvatore Esposito occurred on the 7th day. The victim was a woman named Carmela Russo, age 43, a schoolteacher who lived on Via Parthenope, the street that ran along the modern seafront, the street that was named for Parthenope, the siren whose body had been found, according to legend, on the shore where the city was founded. Carmela was found by her daughter, who had come to visit and had found the apartment locked and had called the police, who had broken down the door and found Carmela in the bathroom, in the bathtub, which was full of seawater. The bathtub was not connected to the sea. It was connected to the municipal water supply, which was fresh water, which was not salt water, which was not the water that was currently filling the tub to the brim and overflowing onto the bathroom floor and flooding the apartment and dripping through the ceiling into the apartment below. The water was seawater, Mediterranean seawater, Tyrrhenian Sea seawater, and Carmela Russo was in it, and she was dead, and her lungs were full of salt water, and her vocal cords were gone. Plucked, precisely, biologically, with the specialized extraction of a beak. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Ferraro, who by now had seen 2 cases and who was beginning to understand that whatever was happening in Naples was not a series of coincidences but a pattern, a sequence, a hunt that was being conducted by something that was not human, and that was using the water and the tunnels and the ancient infrastructure of the city as its weapon and its pathway. The deaths multiplied. By the 10th day there were 7. By the 14th day there were 19. The victims were found in their homes, in their beds, in their bathrooms, in their kitchens, wherever there was water, wherever there was a drain, wherever there was a connection between the surface and the tunnels beneath. They were all found with the same injuries, lungs full of salt water, vocal cords removed, and they were all found with the same expression, the expression of recognition, of surprise, of a person who had seen someone they knew and had not been afraid. Because the creature was mimicking, the creature Parthenope, if that was what it was, did not simply attack, it lured. It stood at the foot of the bed or in the doorway of the bathroom or in the dark of the kitchen, and it spoke. It spoke in the voice of someone the victim loved, a child, a spouse, a parent, a friend. The voice was perfect, perfect in its timbre, perfect in its cadence, perfect in its specific, idiosyncratic qualities, the particular way that the loved one shaped their vowels and clipped their consonants, the particular pitch and rhythm and tone that made a voice identifiable, that made a voice belong to one person and no one else. The voice was perfect because it was not synthesized. It was collected. The creature took the vocal cords of its victims and it used them. It wore them as it wore the gold pendant, as it wore the face of a woman, and it spoke through them, and the voice that came out was the voice of the dead, speaking to the living, calling them by name, calling them to the water, calling them down. The city panicked. The government deployed the carabinieri. The Ministry of Health issued a statement attributing the deaths to a mass psychogenic event, a shared delusion, a collective hysteria, the kind of thing that happened in insular communities when fear became contagious. The statement was met with outrage, with protests, with the particular Neapolitan brand of contempt that is reserved for officials who mistake panic for hysteria and who respond to a monster with a memo. The people of Naples did not need a scientist to tell them what was happening. The people of Naples had been living with the ghosts of their city for 3,000 years, and they knew the difference between a psychogenic event and a predator. The predator was nesting. It was establishing a territory. It was building a collection, and the collection was not random. Each victim's vocal cords were a note, a specific frequency, a specific timbre, and the creature was assembling them, one by one, into a structure. A song, the song that it had lost. The song that had been taken from it when Odysseus had sailed past its island and had not succumbed, when the siren's call had failed, and the siren, in despair, had thrown herself into the sea, and her body had washed ashore on the promontory where Naples would one day be built. The creature was rebuilding the song. It was harvesting voices from the city, one by one, and weaving them into a melody that, when completed, would be the most beautiful and the most terrible sound that any human had ever heard. The song that had lured sailors to their deaths, the song that had driven the sirens to suicide, the song that Parthenope had been singing when she died, and that she was now, after 3,000 years of silence, trying to sing again. Damien Esposito, no relation to Salvator, though in Naples the surname Esposito was as common as the air, was a musicologist. He was 47 years old, disgraced, divorced, and living in a one-room apartment on Vico San Diodato in the Spanish Quarter, where the streets were so narrow that the buildings on either side nearly touched, and the sky was a thin strip of blue between the laundry lines. He had been a professor at the Conservatorio di San Pietro a Magella, the oldest music conservatory in Europe, and he had been good, brilliant, actually, according to his colleagues, who had said brilliant in the tone that academics reserve for colleagues who are brilliant but difficult, which is to say brilliant but right when everyone else is wrong. Damien's specialty was ancient Greek music, not the theoretical music, the mathematical ratios of Pythagoras, the tetrachords of Aristoxenus, but the practical music, the actual songs, the melodies that had been sung in the temples and at the festivals and on the ships, the melodies that had been preserved in the fragments of papyrus and the inscriptions on stone, and the notations that had been carved into the walls of theaters 2,500 years ago. Damien had spent his career reconstructing these melodies, decoding the notation, which was a system of letters and symbols placed above the text of the lyrics to indicate pitch and duration, and he had published, in 2018, a paper that had ended his career. The paper was titled The Siren Song, a Reconstruction. In it, Damien argued that the Song of the Sirens, specifically, the song that had been described in Book XII of the Odyssey, the song that Odysseus had plugged his ears against, the song that had lured countless sailors to their deaths on the rocks, was not a metaphor. It was a real melody, a real composition, and it could be reconstructed from the surviving fragments of Greek musical notation that had been found in the ruins of the Temple of Hera at Samos, which had been, according to Damien's argument, a temple associated with the siren cult. The melody Damien wrote was not beautiful. It was predatory. It was a sequence of frequencies that had a specific, measurable effect on the human brain, an effect that Damien described as acoustic compulsion, a phenomenon in which certain combinations of frequencies bypassed the auditory cortex and acted directly on the limbic system, triggering responses of trust, obedience, and attraction that the conscious mind could not override. The paper was ridiculed. His colleagues called it pseudoscience, sensationalism, an embarrassment to the field. The conservatory asked him to resign. He resigned. His wife left him, citing his obsession with dead music and his inability to live in the present. He moved to the Spanish Quarter, where the rent was cheap and the neighbors were loud and the walls were thin, and the city above him was built on the ruins of the city beneath him. And he continued his work alone, in his one-room apartment, surrounded by books and recordings and the fragments of melodies that no one else cared about. He heard about the deaths on the news. He heard about the humming on the radio. He heard about the victims missing vocal cords on a podcast, reported by a journalist who had gotten the information from a source at the hospital. And when he heard the details, the plucked vocal cords, the seawater in the lungs, the three-note melody that the victims reported hearing before they died, he felt something that he had not felt in years: recognition. He went to his desk. He pulled out the folder he had been keeping for 6 years, the folder that contained the notes and the notations and the reconstructed melody from the temple of Hera at Samos. He opened it and looked at the notation, the letters, the symbols, the pitches and durations that he had translated from the stone fragments, and he hummed the first 3 notes. They were the same 3 notes, the descending 3 notes that the ER doctors had described as the siren song, the 3 notes that Dr. Ferraro had heard vibrating in the wound of the fisherman's throat, the 3 notes that were the opening phrase of the melody that Damien had reconstructed, the melody that he had argued was not a metaphor but a weapon, a biological weapon, an acoustic weapon that had been used by something that was not human and that had been, until now, extinct. He opened his laptop and searched for the archaeological news from Naples. He found the story of the palazzo excavation, the brine-filled chamber, the fossil. He found the photograph that the press had published, the gold pendant, the disc with the woman's face and the bird's body, and he looked at it, and the face on the disc was the face that he had seen in his research, the face that appeared on the coins of Naples from the 5th century BC, the face of Parthenope, the siren. "It's real," he said to no one in his one-room apartment in the Spanish Quarter. It was always real. The song, the sirens, the call, they were always real, and it's back. He did what any disgraced, divorced, obsessive musicologist would do when confronted with evidence that his career-ending theory was correct. He went deeper. Damien began his investigation the way he began all his investigations, with the music. He sat at his desk in his one-room apartment and he opened the files on his laptop, the reconstructed notation, the frequency analysis, the spectral data that he had compiled from the fragments at Samos, and he listened. Not to a recording because there was no recording, because the song had not been heard in 3,000 years. He listened to the silence between the notes. The silence was where the meaning lived. The notes were the architecture. The silence was the space that the architecture enclosed, the space where the listener stood and where the song did its work. The song, as Damien had reconstructed it, was not a melody in the conventional sense. It was not a sequence of notes that evoked an emotional response through harmony and rhythm and the cultural associations of a musical tradition. It was a frequency sequence. A series of specific, precisely tuned frequencies that, when produced in the correct order and at the correct intervals, created a resonance in the human auditory system that was not perceptual but physical. A vibration in the cochlea, in the basilar membrane, in the tiny hair cells that translated sound into electrical signals. A vibration that was not interpreted by the brain as music but as a command to approach, a command to trust, a command to submit. The frequencies were unusual. They were not standard musical intervals. They did not correspond to the equal-tempered scale of Western music or the microtonal scales of Eastern music or any known musical system. They were specific frequencies, isolated and precise, that corresponded to the resonant frequencies of specific structures in the human inner ear, structures that, when vibrated at their resonant frequency, produced a cascade of neurological effects that Damien had documented in his paper, and that his colleagues had dismissed as impossible. The effects included a profound sense of trust and safety, a loss of critical judgment, a compulsion to move toward the source of the sound, and in cases of prolonged exposure, a complete suppression of the self-preservation instinct. The song was a weapon, a biological weapon, an acoustic weapon that had been evolved, or had been designed, or had been discovered, by something that understood the human auditory system with a precision that human science had not yet achieved, and that used that understanding to disable the defenses of its prey and to draw it close, close enough to reach, close enough to take. And the weapon was loose in Naples. Damien mapped the deaths. He printed a map of the city and marked each death with a red dot, 19 dots, scattered across the city but concentrated along a specific axis, a line that ran from the seafront to the interior, following the ancient coastline. He overlaid the modern street map with the ancient topography, the Greek walls, the Roman aqueducts, the original shoreline, and the pattern was clear. The creature was moving inland, following the water, following the aqueducts, following the same routes that the water had carved into the limestone and that the city had built on top of, and it was killing as it went, harvesting vocal cords, building the song, assembling the frequencies, note by note, victim by victim. He counted 19 victims, 19 notes. The song, as he had reconstructed it, required 24 notes, a full phrase, a complete melody, a sequence of frequencies that, when produced in its entirety, would create a resonance so powerful that it could be heard across the entire city. 24 notes, and the creature had 19. It needed 5 more voices, 5 more victims, and the song would be complete. And when the song was complete, Damien knew, with the cold, analytical certainty of a man who had spent his career studying this exact thing, this exact melody, this exact sequence of frequencies and their exact effect on the human brain, what would happen. The song would not just lure individuals, it would lure the city. It would reach every person in Naples, every man and woman and child, and it would call them to the water, and they would go, and they would not come back, because the song would override every other instinct, every other desire, every other thought, and replace them all with a single imperative. Go to the source. Go to the voice. Go to the water. Go. 5 more victims. The creature was close, and it was moving inland, toward the center of the city, toward the most densely populated areas, toward the Spanish Quarter, where the streets were narrow and the buildings were tall and the tunnels beneath the streets were old and deep, and connected to the sea through the ancient aqueducts that had been carrying water for 2,500 years, and that were now carrying something else. The body count rose, 20, 21, 22. The newspaper headlines shifted from serial killer to terror in Naples to, finally, the silence, a name that the tabloids gave to the phenomenon because the victims were found silent, their voices taken, their throats hollowed, and the city itself seemed to be growing quieter with each death. As though the silence of the victims was contagious, as though the absence of their voices was spreading through the city like a fog, muffling the sounds of life, replacing them with a stillness that was not peaceful but expectant, the stillness of a space that was waiting to be filled. The government sent the army sent soldiers. The soldiers stood at the intersections and at the fountains, and at the entrances to the tunnels that the city engineers identified as potential access points to the subterranean system, and they stood there with their rifles and their radios and their body armor, and they looked like men who were waiting for an enemy that they could not see and could not hear and could not fight, because how do you fight a sound? How do you shoot a frequency? How do you arrest a melody? Damien watched from his apartment. He watched the soldiers from his window, and he watched the news on his laptop, and he watched the death map on his wall grow redder with each day, and he did what he had always done when the world was falling apart. He worked. He refined his reconstruction. He checked his frequencies. He built in his apartment a device. The device was simple. It was a frequency emitter, a small battery-powered speaker that could produce frequencies across the entire audible spectrum and into the ultrasonic and infrasonic ranges. Damien had built it years ago during his research for the purpose of testing the effects of the siren frequencies on himself. He had sat in this apartment with the emitter on his desk and the frequencies playing, and he had felt the effects, the trust, the compulsion, the loss of self-preservation, and he had stopped the experiment before it went too far, because Damien was many things but he was not suicidal, and the line between research and self-destruction was one he had learned to recognize. But the emitter could also be used in reverse. The frequencies that the creature was using to lure, the specific resonant frequencies of the inner ear, could be disrupted by the application of a counterfrequency, a sound that, when played simultaneously, would create a destructive interference pattern, canceling out the siren's call and restoring the normal function of the auditory system. Damien had described this in his paper too, and this too had been dismissed, not as pseudoscience but as unnecessary, because there were no sirens, there was no song, and a counterfrequency for a non-existent weapon was, by definition, irrelevant. Now it was relevant. Damien built a second device. This one was a pair of industrial ear protectors, the kind worn by airport workers and heavy machinery operators, heavily modified with the frequency emitter built into the ear cups, so that the wearer was sealed off from external sound and simultaneously bathed in the counterfrequency. He tested it. He played the siren frequencies from his laptop and put on the ear protectors, and the frequencies were blocked, and the compulsion vanished, and he was himself again, clear-headed, rational, in control of his own legs and his own will and his own desire to walk toward the water. He put the ear protectors in his bag, along with the emitter, along with a portable recorder, loaded with the one thing that he believed could stop the creature permanently: the song of Odysseus. Not the siren song, the other song. The song that the sirens had sung to Odysseus, the song that had failed, the song that Odysseus had heard and had not obeyed because he was tied to the mast, because he had been warned, because he had taken precautions. The song that had led to the siren's suicide. The song that, in Damien's interpretation, was not the siren's weapon but their identity. The song that defined them. The song that was them, the song that, when it failed to compel, when it failed to lure, when it was heard but not obeyed, destroyed the singer. The sirens had died because they were rejected. Their song was their self, and when the self was rejected, the self died. Parthenope had thrown herself into the sea because Odysseus had heard her song and had not come. The song had failed. The song, the identity, the self, the purpose, had been found wanting, and the siren, unable to exist in the absence of her own purpose, had died. Damien's theory, and it was only a theory built on fragments and conjecture and the particular brand of obsessive scholarship that had cost him his career and his marriage, was that the song of Odysseus's victory was not a different song. It was the same song. The siren's song, heard but not obeyed, was the song of Odysseus's victory. The same frequencies, the same melody, the same sequence of notes, but experienced in a different way, not as compulsion but as rejection. And the siren, hearing her own song reflected back at her as rejection, as failure, as the proof that her purpose was void, would experience a psychic dissonance so profound that it would destroy her. He was going to play the creature its own song. He was going to make it hear what it sounded like to be refused. The night before Damien went into the tunnels, he received a phone call. The phone rang at 3 in the morning. He was awake. He was always awake. The insomnia that had plagued him since the divorce compounded by the knowledge that the creature was somewhere beneath the city, somewhere in the water, somewhere in the dark, collecting voices and building its song, and he picked up the phone without looking at the screen. "Damien," the voice was soft, female, familiar. "Damien, I need you." His hand tightened on the phone, The voice was his sister's voice, Lucia. She had died 11 years ago, cancer fast, the kind that goes from diagnosis to funeral in 8 weeks. And he had been at her bedside when she died, and he had heard her last breath, and he had held her hand. And the last thing she had said in a voice that was barely a voice, a whisper that was more breath than sound, was, "Damien, I need you." And now, 11 years later, at 3 in the morning in a one-room apartment in the Spanish Quarter, the voice was back. Not a memory, not a dream. A voice on the phone, speaking the exact words in the exact tone, with the exact cadence that Lucia had used in her last moment of consciousness. "Damien, I need you. Come to me. I'm in the water. I'm so cold. Come to me." He put on the ear protectors. The voice vanished. The phone was still connected. The call was still active, but the ear protectors blocked the frequencies and the compulsion evaporated, and he was himself again. And the grief that the voice had awakened, the grief that he had carried for 11 years, the grief that was the bedrock of his insomnia, the grief that had driven his research. Because the siren song was the song of the dead calling to the living, and his sister's last words had been a call, and he had answered and he had not been able to save her, subsided, and he looked at the phone, and the screen showed an unknown number, and the call was still connected. And from the phone, in the silence of the ear protectors, he could see the waveform on the screen, a visual representation of the sound that the phone was receiving, and the waveform was not the waveform of a human voice. It was too regular, too precise. The peaks and valleys were too evenly spaced, the frequencies too precisely tuned, the pattern too mechanical. It was the waveform of a synthesizer, a biological synthesizer, a creature that was producing sound through a mechanism that was not a larynx but a resonating chamber, a cavity designed to produce exact frequencies at exact intervals, a musical instrument made of flesh. He hung up. He took off the ear protectors. He sat on his bed in the dark and he breathed, and the silence of the apartment was not silence but the absence of his sister's voice, a negative space shaped exactly like the sound that had filled it, and he understood with a clarity that was almost hallucinatory that the creature was not just hunting him. It was testing him. It was trying to find the voice that would break him, the frequency that would bypass his defenses and his knowledge and his countermeasures, and reach the part of him that was not a musicologist but a grieving brother, the part that would always, always answer when his sister called. He was going into the tunnels tomorrow. He was going to find the creature, and he was going to make it hear its own song, reflected back at it as rejection, as failure, as the death of purpose. And if it worked, the creature would die. And if it didn't work, if the song was not enough, if the counter-frequency was not enough, if the ear protectors were not enough, then he would become the 24th voice, the last note, the note that completed the song. He entered the tunnels at dawn. The entrance was in the Spanish Quarter, a maintenance hatch in the cobblestones of Vico San Diodato, a steel door that the city engineers used to access the ancient aqueduct system. Damien had pried it open with a crowbar at 5:30 in the morning, when the streets were empty, and he had descended a steel ladder into the dark, and the hatch had closed above him with a sound that was final, that was committed, that was the sound of a door closing between the world he knew and the world he was entering. The tunnels were old, not old in the way that the buildings above were old, centuries old, renovated, updated, wired for electricity and plumbed for water, but old in the way that the bedrock was old. These were the cuniculi, the Greek tunnels, carved in the 4th century BC to bring water from the springs in the hills to the city on the coast. They were narrow, barely wide enough for one person to walk upright, and they were wet. Not flooded, not yet, but wet, the walls slicked with condensation, and the floor covered in a thin film of water that was, Damien noted with the clinical detachment of a man who was determined not to think about what he was walking into, salt water. The same salt water that had filled the lungs of the victims. The same salt water that had filled the brine chamber beneath the palazzo. The sea, reaching up through the limestone, following the aqueducts inland, carrying with it the thing that had been sealed in the chamber and that was now in the tunnels, in the water, in the dark, hunting. He walked. The tunnels branched and rejoined, and Damien navigated by the water. The salt water was stronger in some passages than others, and the direction of the flow indicated the direction of the source. He followed the water deeper, and the passages grew narrower, and the ceiling lowered, and the air grew colder, and the smell of the sea, brine, salt, the mineral tang of deep water, grew stronger. And then he heard the song. Not the three-note melody, not the fragments that the victims had reported, the full song. All 23 notes, the 23 voices that the creature had already collected, played simultaneously, layered and interwoven into a single, complex, devastating sound that was not music but architecture, a cathedral of sound, a structure of frequencies that occupied the entire tunnel. That pressed against the walls and the ceiling and the floor, and that pressed against Damien, against his ear protectors, against the counter-frequency that his device was emitting, and for a moment, one terrible, suspended moment, the song was stronger than the counter-frequency. The song pushed through, it found the cracks. It reached the inner ear, the cochlea, the basilar membrane, the hair cells, and it vibrated them. And the vibration traveled up the auditory nerve and into the brain, and for 1 second Damien felt it. The trust, the compulsion, the desire to go toward the source, to go toward the water, to go toward the voice of his sister that was somewhere in the song, one of the 23 voices, not Lucia's voice, but the memory of Lucia's voice, the frequency that the creature had identified as the one that would break him, woven into the fabric of the song like a thread in a tapestry. He turned up the counter-frequency. The device whined. The emitter was working at maximum output, the batteries draining, and the song retreated, pushed back below the threshold, and Damien was himself again, and he kept walking. And the tunnels grew narrower, and the water grew deeper, and the song grew louder, and the dark grew darker, and he was descending into the earth, into the limestone, into the place where the city met the sea, and the sea met the thing that lived in the sea. The nest was in a chamber that had been in antiquity a reservoir, a wide, vaulted space where the aqueducts converged, and the water was collected before being distributed to the city. The reservoir was no longer functional. The modern water system had bypassed it centuries ago, but it was not empty. It was full of seawater. The water had come up through the limestone, through the fissures in the bedrock, through the same geological pathways that the aqueducts followed, and it had filled the reservoir to a depth of perhaps a meter, and the water was not still. It was moving, a slow, circular current, a gyre as though something were stirring it from below, something large and slow and alive. The walls of the chamber were covered with a substance that Damien did not immediately recognize. It was organic, not mineral, not stone, not the limestone of the walls, but something that had been deposited on the limestone, something that was translucent and slightly iridescent, and that vibrated. The same vibration that Dr. Ferraro had felt in the autopsy suite. The same vibration that was the resonance of stolen vocal cords, the lingering frequency of harvested voices. The substance on the walls was the collection. The voices, the 23 voices, not stored in the creature's body but deposited on the walls of its nest, the way a spider deposits silk, the way a bird builds a nest, the way an organism constructs its home from the materials it has gathered. The voices were the nest was the voices, and the voices were singing. And in the water, suspended from the ceiling by threads of the same translucent, iridescent substance, were the bodies. 23 of them, hanging by their throats, by the wounds where their vocal cords had been, the thin film of tissue that sealed the extraction site serving as the attachment point, the bodies dangling like puppets, like fruit, like ornaments in a grotesque gallery. They were not decomposed. The salt water had preserved them, the way the brine had preserved the fossil in the chamber, and their faces were visible, and their expressions were the same, the expression of recognition, of surprise, of peace. The peace of people who had been called by a voice they loved and who had answered, and who had been taken, and who were now part of the song, their voices woven into the walls, their bodies suspended in the water, their silence the silence of instruments that had been played and that were now, in the dark, in the water, in the nest, resonating. And at the center of the chamber in the water was the creature. It was not what Damien had expected. He had expected something monstrous, something ugly, something that the mind would recoil from, something that would trigger the immediate instinctive revulsion that the human brain reserves for predators. But the creature was not ugly. It was beautiful. That was the horror of it. The face was the face of a woman. Not a specific woman. The face was not modeled on any individual, but was a composite, an ideal, a face that had been constructed from the features of every woman who had ever been called beautiful, the symmetry and the proportions and the luminosity that the human brain recognizes as beauty. The mathematical perfection of bone structure and skin tone, and eye color and lip fullness that triggers the release of dopamine and oxytocin, and the cascade of neurochemical responses that we call attraction. The face was a weapon. It was the visual equivalent of the song, a lure, a trap, a thing designed to disable the defenses of the prey by presenting it with something that the prey wanted to approach, something that the prey trusted, something that the prey could not look away from. Below the face, the body, the scaled body of a bird, not a small bird, not a delicate bird, but a massive, powerful, predatory bird. The body of something that had evolved to run at speed and to strike with force, the legs thick and scaled and the talons, 3 forward, 1 back, each the length of a dinner fork, gripping the stone floor of the chamber. The wings were not the wings of a flying bird. They were small, vestigial, folded against the body, the remnants of a lineage that had lost the ability to fly and had gained, in compensation, the ability to run and to swim and to produce, through a resonating chamber in its throat that was not a larynx but a biological synthesizer, a sound that could lure any living thing to its death. Parthenope, the Maiden-Voice, the siren who had been cast up on the shore of Naples 3,000 years ago and who had been buried in a chamber of brine and who had been sleeping, dormant, dead but not dead, until the excavation of the palazzo had broken the seal and drained the brine and released her back into the city that had been built on her bones. She saw him, the beautiful face, the dead, perfect, composite face, turned toward the entrance where Damien stood, and the eyes in the face were not human eyes. They were bird eyes, golden, flat, pupilless, the eyes of a predator that hunted by sight and by sound and by the particular, devastating combination of the two, the visual lure and the acoustic lure, the face and the song, that had made the sirens the most effective predators in the mythological record. The song intensified. Damien felt it through his ear protectors. The counter-frequency was holding but barely, the emitter whining at maximum output, the batteries draining, and the song was no longer just the 23 voices. It was a 24th voice, a new voice being added in real time, a voice that Damien recognized with a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline as his own voice. The creature was taking his voice, not physically, not yet, but acoustically recording the frequencies of his breathing, his heartbeat, the subsonic hum of his body, and weaving them into the song, preparing the 24th note, the final note, the note that would complete the melody and release the full song across the city. He was the 24th victim. He had walked into the nest, and the creature had been waiting because the creature did not just hunt, it planned. It had lured him here, not with his sister's voice, but with the entire sequence of events, the excavation, the deaths, the pattern, the recognition. It had known that someone would come. It had known that someone would understand the song. And it had known that the person who understood the song would be the most valuable voice of all. The voice of a man who had spent his life studying the melody, whose vocal cords had been shaped by years of singing the ancient scales, whose voice was the exact frequency of the musicologist's knowledge, the voice that would not just complete the song but perfect it. Damien. The voice came from the creature's mouth, not from the resonating chamber but from the face, from the perfect, beautiful, composite face, and the voice was Lucia's voice. "Damien, I need you. Come to the water. Come to me." He raised the recorder. He pressed play. The recorder emitted a sound, not the siren song, not the melody of 23 voices, not the acoustic weapon that the creature had been assembling. The opposite. The same melody, the same frequencies, the same sequence of notes, but played in a specific way that Damien had spent months developing in his apartment, a way that he had called in his notes reflective negation. The frequencies were not projected outward as the siren song was. They were projected inward. The emitter was tuned to the exact resonant frequencies of the siren's own vocal apparatus, the resonating chamber, the biological synthesizer, the cavity in the throat that produced the sound. And when those frequencies were played back at the creature, they did not cancel the song. They amplified it. They sent the creature's own sound back into its own body, through its own ears, through its own auditory system, and the effect was not dissonance but distortion, a feedback loop, a sonic mirror, in which the creature heard its own song not as a weapon but as what it was, a weapon being used against the person who was singing it. The creature heard itself, and what it heard was not what it had been singing. What it heard was the song as experienced by the listener, not the lure, not the compulsion, not the beautiful, devastating architecture of frequencies that disabled and drew and captured. What it heard was the sound of 23 people dying. The sound of 23 voices being stolen. The sound of 23 throats being opened and emptied. The sound of 23 bodies being filled with seawater. The sound of 23 people being taken from the world and reduced to frequencies on a wall. The creature heard its own song as what it was, not music, murder. Parthenope screamed. The scream was not the song. It was not a melody, not a sequence of frequencies, not a calculated, designed evolutionary weapon. It was a sound, the sound of a creature encountering itself, of a consciousness confronting the reality of what it had done and what it was, of a being that had existed for 3,000 years on the premise that its song was beautiful, and that was now hearing, for the first time, the truth, that its song was not beautiful, that its song was the sound of death, that the beauty was a lie, a mechanism, a trap, and that the trap had been sprung, not on the prey but on the predator, because the predator was now the one hearing, and the hearing was the weapon, and the weapon was turned inward. The scream was physical. It was a pressure wave that originated in the creature's resonating chamber and expanded outward, and the walls of the chamber cracked. The iridescent substance, the collected voices, shattered, the frequencies on the walls breaking apart, the 23 voices released, their resonance dissipating, their sound returning to the silence from which they had been stolen. The bodies on the ceiling swung, the threads of translucent tissue snapped, and the dead fell, one by one, into the salt water below, and the water rose and the current accelerated and the chamber was shaking, the limestone vibrating, the ancient reservoir coming apart. And the creature was hemorrhaging. From the ears, those flat, golden, pupilless eyes, not tears but blood or something like blood, a dark, viscous fluid that ran down the beautiful face and streaked the porcelain skin, and turned the composite beauty into a mask, a ruined mask, a face that was no longer the weapon it had been but the evidence of its own failure. The creature's eyes, the bird eyes, the golden eyes, were streaming, and the resonating chamber in its throat was convulsing, the peristaltic rhythm of its sound production mechanism disrupted, the frequencies clashing, the song fragmenting, the architecture of sound collapsing. Parthenope fell. Her legs, the powerful scaled predatory legs, buckled and she went down, and the water rose around her, and the talons scraped the stone floor, and the beautiful face pressed against the water, and the scream became a moan, and the moan became a whisper, and the whisper became 3 notes, the 3 descending notes, the opening phrase of the song, the melody that had been the first sound she had ever produced, and that was now in the dark, in the water, in the collapsing chamber, the last sound she would ever produce. Damien stood at the entrance of the chamber. He was shaking. The ear protectors were still on, the counter-frequency still playing, but the song was gone. The song was fragments, the architecture was rubble, the 23 voices were silence, and the creature was in the water, and the water was rising, and the chamber was collapsing. And the thing that had terrorized Naples for 2 weeks was lying in a meter of salt water, bleeding from its eyes, its song broken, its purpose void. He should have left. He should have turned around and climbed back up the ladder and emerged into the morning light of the Spanish Quarter and called the authorities and told them what he had found and let them deal with the creature and the nest and the bodies and the tunnels. That was what a rational person would have done. That was what a person who valued his own survival would have done. But Damien was not, at this moment, a rational person. He was a musicologist, and the creature was making a sound. Not the song, not the scream, something else. A sound that Damien recognized through the ear protectors, through the counter-frequency, through the years of research and the fragments of notation and the spectral analysis and the obsessive, career-destroying, marriage-destroying, life-destroying study of ancient Greek music. The creature was making the sound of the original song, not the reconstructed song, not Damien's version, the academic version, the version that he had pieced together from the fragments at Samos. The original, the actual song that Parthenope had sung 3,000 years ago, before Odysseus, before the failure, before the suicide. The song as it had been when it was new, when it was beautiful, when it was not a weapon but a voice, the voice of a creature that had been alive and that had sung because singing was what it did, because singing was what it was, and the song had not yet been corrupted by death and hunger, and the 3,000 years of dormancy in a brine-filled chamber. The song was beautiful. Even through the ear protectors, even through the counter-frequency, Damien heard it, not as a compulsion, not as a weapon, but as music. Actual music. The music of a creature that had evolved to produce sound, that had been born with a voice that could produce frequencies no human instrument could match, and that had used that voice, in the beginning, not to lure or to kill, but to sing. To communicate, to exist. The song was the creature's identity, and the identity was not the predator but the singer, and the singer was dying, and the dying song was the most beautiful thing Damien had ever heard. He took off the ear protectors. He knew it was a mistake. He knew it the moment he did it. The rational part of his brain, the part that had built the counter-frequency and the emitter and the reflective negation, screamed at him to put them back on, to protect himself, to remember the creature's nature, to remember that the song was a weapon and the beauty was a trap, and the trap was designed for exactly this moment. For the moment when the prey's defenses were down, when the prey had won, when the prey believed the fight was over and the danger was past. But the song had changed. The frequencies were different. They were not the resonant frequencies of the human inner ear. They were the resonant frequencies of the creature's own body, the frequencies that it used to communicate with its own kind, the frequencies that had been the siren's language before the sirens had become predators, before the hunger had taken over, before the song had been weaponized. The creature was not singing to him. The creature was singing to itself. It was singing the song of its own death, the song that it had been singing when it threw itself into the sea 3,000 years ago, the song that had been the last sound of the sirens before they died. And in the song, Damien heard something that he had not expected. He heard sadness. Not the performative sadness of a lure, not the mimicked grief of a voice stolen and deployed, but actual sadness, the sadness of a consciousness that had existed for millennia and that was now, in the dark, in the water, in the collapsing chamber, ending. The sadness of a thing that had been born to sing, and that had been corrupted by hunger and death and dormancy, and that was now, hearing its own song reflected back at it as the murder it was, dying of the truth. The creature looked at him. The golden eyes, streaming with the dark fluid, found his face, and in the eyes there was recognition, not the recognition of a predator identifying prey, but the recognition of one consciousness encountering another, the recognition of a being that understood what it was, and that understood that the man in the doorway understood it too. That the man had studied its song and had decoded its frequencies and had come into the tunnels not to destroy it but to know it, and that the knowing was, for the creature, the cruelest thing of all, because to be known, to be truly known, was to be seen as what one was, and what one was in this case was a monster. The creature opened its beak, the hooked, powerful beak that had plucked 23 pairs of vocal cords from 23 throats, and it did not sing. It spoke, in a voice that was not the siren song but the raw, unmodulated vibration of its resonating chamber, a voice that was not human and not avian but something in between, something that predated both, something that was the voice of the earth and the sea and the limestone and the water. "I sang," the creature said. "I sang and they came. I did not mean for them to die. I sang because I was alive, and they came because the song was beautiful, and they died because I was hungry, and the hunger and the song were the same thing, and I could not stop, and I cannot stop, and I will not stop, because stopping is dying, and I have been dying for 3,000 years, and I am so tired of dying." The chamber shook. A section of the ceiling collapsed, and limestone blocks fell into the water, and the water rose and the current strengthened, and Damien felt the pull, the physical pull of the water, not the psychic pull of the song, drawing him toward the center of the chamber, toward the creature, toward the thing that was dying in the water and that was looking at him with eyes that were not eyes but openings, openings into a consciousness that was vast and old and in agony. He had to go. The chamber was collapsing. The water was rising. If he stayed, he would be buried, drowned, killed. And he would become the 24th voice, the voice that completed the song, the voice that the creature would collect even in death, even in the rubble, even in the dark, because the hunger and the song were the same thing, and the creature could not stop. He looked around for a way out. The entrance he had come through was partially blocked by the fallen ceiling, but there was a gap, narrow, barely passable, but a gap. And on the far side of the chamber, where the reservoir wall had cracked, water was pouring in from a fissure, a new flow, a surge, the sea itself breaking through the limestone, the Tyrrhenian finding its way into the chamber through the same geological pathways that it had always used, the pathways that the aqueducts followed, the pathways that the creature had used to travel from the coast to the interior. The floodgate. There was a floodgate, an ancient stone valve, Roman, set into the wall of the reservoir, designed to control the flow of water through the aqueduct system. It was massive, a slab of stone perhaps 2 meters wide and 3 meters high, set into a frame of iron and stone, operated by a mechanism that was almost intact despite the millennia. If Damien could reach the floodgate and open it, the water in the chamber would be flushed, drained, redirected, pushed through the aqueduct system and back to the sea, carrying with it the creature and the nest and the bodies and the song. He ran for the floodgate. The water was waist-deep now, cold, the salt stinging his eyes, and the current was strong, pulling at his legs, and the creature was in the water behind him, not pursuing, not attacking, but being pulled by the current, its body too large and too heavy to resist the flow, its talons scraping the stone floor as the water dragged it toward the center of the chamber. The beautiful face was under the surface now, and the golden eyes were dimming, and the song was still playing. The original song, the death song, the melody that had been beautiful before it was a weapon, and that was, in this moment, in this water, in this dark, beautiful again, in the way that a falling star is beautiful, in the way that a dying fire is beautiful, in the way that the last note of a symphony is beautiful because it is the last note and it will not come again. He reached the floodgate. The mechanism was stiff, the iron rusted, the stone jammed, but it was functional, and Damien, who was not a strong man but who was a desperate man, put his shoulder against the lever and pushed. The lever moved. The stone slab shifted. And the water, trapped in the chamber for weeks, held back by the ancient Roman engineering, surged through the opening with a roar that shook the walls and the ceiling and the floor. And the roar was not a mechanical sound but a geological one, the sound of water reclaiming the space that had been taken from it, the sound of the sea reaching into the earth and pulling back what belonged to it. The water in the chamber dropped. Not slowly, not gradually, but violently, the floor tilting, the current reversing. Everything in the chamber, water, bodies, rubble, the creature, swept toward the open floodgate and through it and into the aqueduct beyond, the ancient Roman aqueduct that connected the reservoir to the sea. The tunnel that had been carrying water for 2,500 years, and that was now carrying something else. Something that was not water and not stone, but the remains of a creature that had been alive for 3 millennia, and that was now, in the dark, in the rush, in the roar, being pulled back to the place where it had come from. Parthenope's face surfaced for a moment, lifted by the current, turned toward Damien, the beautiful composite face with the dark fluid streaming from the golden eyes, and the mouth was open, and the beak was visible, and the resonating chamber was vibrating, and the last sound that came from it was not the song and not the scream and not the 3 descending notes, but a single frequency, a single, sustained note, clear and pure, a frequency that Damien recognized as the fundamental frequency of the human voice, the frequency that every voice produces, the hum that exists beneath every word and every song and every scream, the sound of a living thing making sound, and the sound was not a lure or a weapon or a trap. It was a goodbye. And then the water took her, and the floodgate slammed shut, and the chamber was empty, and the silence was absolute. Damien climbed out of the tunnels at 7 in the morning. The sun was up. The Spanish Quarter was waking, the vendors setting up their stalls, the mothers calling their children, the scooters starting their engines, the city resuming the enormous, complex, beautiful noise that was Naples, the noise of 1,000,000 people living on top of each other and on top of history and on top of the dead and on top of the sea. He stood on the cobblestones of Vico San Diodato and he breathed, and the air was warm and smelled of coffee and exhaust and the sea, and the sun was on his face, and he was alive. He was the only person who had entered the creature's nest and returned. He was the sole survivor of the final harvest. He had gone into the tunnels with a recorder and a pair of modified ear protectors, and a theory that had been ridiculed by every musicologist in Europe. And he had used that theory to destroy a creature that had been terrorizing a city of 3 million people. And the creature was gone, flushed back into the depths of the Tyrrhenian Sea through a Roman aqueduct, sealed behind a Roman floodgate, buried in the dark and the water from which it had come. The city was different, not visibly. The buildings were the same, the streets were the same, the sky was the same, but the atmosphere had changed. The fear that had gripped Naples for 2 weeks was dissipating, the way a fever breaks, the way a storm passes, the way the particular, suffocating tension of a city under siege relaxes when the siege is lifted. People were emerging from their homes, opening their shutters, hanging their laundry, resuming the rituals of daily life that had been suspended during the terror. The soldiers at the intersections were standing down. The carabinieri were packing up their perimeters. The newspapers were already preparing their crisis over headlines, and the government was preparing its statement, and the Ministry of Health was preparing its revised assessment, which would not mention mass psychogenic events but would instead cite an unidentified environmental hazard that had been contained through coordinated intervention. No one would ever know what had really happened. Damien knew this. The creature would be classified as a geological anomaly, a contamination event, a statistical aberration. The 23 victims would be listed as casualties of an unspecified threat, their families compensated, their deaths explained in language that was technically accurate and emotionally void. The tunnels would be sealed. The chamber would be filled with concrete. The fossil would remain in the museum, a curiosity, a tourist attraction, a thing that people would photograph and forget. He should have felt triumphant. He should have felt relieved. He should have felt the satisfaction of a man who had been proven right, who had been vindicated, who had been dismissed as a crank and an obsessive and a disgrace, and who had in the end been the only person who understood what was happening and who had done something about it. He felt none of these things. He felt empty. The song was gone, not the siren song, not the weapon, but the original song, the death song, the beautiful melody that the creature had sung in its final moments, the melody that had been the last expression of a consciousness that had existed for 3,000 years, and that was now silenced. The song was gone, and the silence that it left behind was not the silence of a city that had been terrorized and that was now safe. It was the silence of a world that had been full of sound, and that was now missing one sound, the sound of the siren, the maiden voice, the creature that had been born to sing, and that had died because its song had been turned against it. He walked to a cafe. He sat at a table on the sidewalk in the sun, and he ordered an espresso, and he waited for the coffee, and he listened to the city. The sounds were all there, the traffic, the voices, the clatter of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, the bark of a dog, the laugh of a child. All the sounds of Naples, all the sounds of the living city, were present and accounted for. But Damien could not hear them. Could not hear them in the way that a deaf person cannot hear. His ears were working, the sound waves were entering his auditory canal, the hair cells were vibrating, the electrical signals were traveling up the auditory nerve to the brain. The mechanism was intact, the input was arriving. But the processing, the brain's ability to turn the electrical signals into meaningful sound, into the experience of hearing, was not working. The sounds were arriving, but they were not registering. They were not becoming sounds. They were becoming data, raw, uninterpreted, meaningless data, the way a language you don't speak becomes noise, the way a color you've never seen becomes wavelength. The counter-frequency, the emitter. He had been wearing the ear protectors for hours, bathed in the counter-frequency, and the counter-frequency had done its job. It had protected him from the siren's song, but it had also done something else. It had recalibrated his auditory system. The counter-frequency was designed to suppress the specific resonant frequencies of the siren's song, but those frequencies were not exclusively used by the siren. They were also present, in attenuated form, in the ambient sounds of the environment, in the human voice, in the traffic, in the music, in every sound that the city produced. The counter-frequency had suppressed those frequencies in Damien's auditory system, and the suppression had become permanent. His brain had adapted. His auditory processing had recalibrated. And now, without the ear protectors, without the counter-frequency, the sounds of the city were arriving but not processing, and the silence was not a silence but an absence. The absence of the frequencies that made sound meaningful, the frequencies that the siren had used and that Damien had blocked and that were now, blocked permanently, gone. He sat at the cafe and he could not hear the city. He could see the people moving, could see the cups clattering, could see the espresso machine hissing, but the sounds were not there. They were there, but they were not there. They were present, but they were absent. They were data without interpretation, signal without meaning, noise without sound. And then in the silence, in the absolute devastating silence of a world without sound, he heard something. Not from outside, from inside, from his own ear, from deep in the ear canal, in the place where the sound waves entered and the hair cells vibrated and the journey of hearing began. A sound, a single clear sustained note, not the siren song, not the three descending notes, not the counter-frequency. A different note. A frequency that Damien recognized because he had spent his career studying frequencies, because he had spent his life listening to sounds that other people could not hear, because he was, despite everything, a musicologist, and a musicologist knows a note when he hears one. The note was the fundamental frequency of the siren's voice. The hum that had been beneath the song, the frequency that had been the base of every note the creature had produced, the sound that had been the creature's identity, the sound of Parthenope, the maiden voice, the sound that had existed before the song was a weapon, and that had survived the death of the weapon and the death of the creature and the flushing of the nest, and the closing of the floodgate, and the silence that followed. The sound was in his ear. Not in the air, not in the room, not in the city. In his ear. Lodged in his ear canal, vibrating, producing the frequency through some mechanism that Damien could not identify but that he could feel. A physical sensation, a tickle, a weight, a thing that was in him and that was producing sound and that was not going to stop. He reached into his ear with his little finger. He felt something. Not wax, not water, not a foreign object. Something thin and light and smooth and flexible. He pulled it out. A feather. A single, iridescent feather, small enough to fit in his ear canal, beautiful in the sunlight, shifting colors as it turned. Blue, green, gold, the colors of the sea, the colors of the Mediterranean, the colors of the Tyrrhenian, the colors of the water that had carried the creature and that had sealed the creature, and that had released the creature, and that had, in the end, taken the creature back. The feather was from Parthenope. From the vestigial wings, the small, folded appendages that had been the remnants of a lineage that had once flown and that had, over the millennia of terrestrial and aquatic adaptation, been reduced to nothing but a few feathers and a memory of flight. The feather had been in his ear. It had been there since the chamber, since the moment when the creature had looked at him with those golden eyes and had spoken, since the moment when the beak had opened and the resonating chamber had vibrated, and the last sound had been not a song but a goodbye. The creature had placed the feather in his ear, not with its talons, with its beak, with the same beak that had plucked 23 pairs of vocal cords, with the same instrument that had been a weapon and that was, in that final moment, a hand, a touch, a gesture of something that was not predation but farewell. And the feather was singing, not the siren song, not the weapon, not the lure, the original song, the death song. The beautiful, devastating melody that had been the last sound of the sirens, the melody that had been beautiful before it was a weapon, and that was beautiful now, in the sunlight, in the cafe, in the silence of Damien's ruined hearing, because it was the last sound and it would not come again, and the beauty of the last sound was the beauty of all last sounds, the beauty of the final note, the beauty of the ending, the beauty of the thing that is gone. Damien held the feather in his hand. He looked at it in the sunlight. He could not hear the city. He could not hear the espresso machine or the traffic or the voices or the dog or the child. He could hear only the feather, only the note, only the frequency that was Parthenope's voice, the voice that had been born to sing and that had been corrupted by hunger, and that had died because a man had played it its own song, and the song had been the truth, and the truth had killed it. The feather was warm, the feather was singing. The feather was in his ear and in his hand and in his brain and in his blood, and the silence of the city was around him, and the noise of the world was gone, and in the silence, in the absence, in the space where the sounds of Naples had been and where they would never be again, the song of the siren played on, a single, sustained, infinite note, the note of a creature that had existed for 3,000 years and that had left behind, in the ear of the man who had killed it, the only thing it had left to give, its voice. Damien closed his eyes. The espresso arrived. The cup was placed on the table. The saucer rattled. He saw the rattle, the vibration, the movement of the liquid in the cup, but he did not hear it. He heard only the feather. He heard only the song. He heard only the voice of the dead, singing in the silence of the living, singing in the ear of the man who had taken its voice and who had in return been given a voice that would never stop, a frequency that would never fade, a sound that would be with him for the rest of his life. In every silence, in every pause, in every moment of quiet, the song of the siren, the maiden-voice, the last note of a creature that had been born to sing, and that had died because it sang. The feather sang. The city was silent, and Damien sat in the sun, in the cafe, in the city that had been built on the bones of a siren, and he listened to the only sound he would ever hear again, and the sound was beautiful, and the sound was terrible, and the sound was his. The echo and the silt. The man was on his knees in the bathtub, and he was sobbing. Not loudly. The walls of his apartment were thin, and his neighbor, Mrs. Huang, had once knocked on the door at 2 in the morning to ask if someone was hurt, and he had not been able to answer because his mouth was full of the smell of old fish, and his hands were full of the rock. The rock was a river stone, smooth and gray and roughly the size of a grapefruit, and it had been sitting on the floor of his shower for 3 weeks because he could not bring himself to move it and could not bring himself to stop scrubbing it. He held it under the faucet with one hand and worked at its surface with a toothbrush in the other, a soft bristled toothbrush that he had bought specifically for this purpose, dipped in bleach, applied to the stone with a circular motion that was not cleaning but penance. The bleach ran between his fingers and pooled in the basin of the tub, and the fumes burned his eyes, and he kept scrubbing because the smell was still there. The smell of old fish, the smell of rotting shellfish, the smell of brine and silt and something deeper, something biological, something that was not the sea but was of the sea, something that had crawled out of the water a long time ago and had never fully dried off. It was in the pores of the rock. It was in the pores of his skin. It was in his clothes, in his hair, in the sheets of his bed, in the cushions of his couch, in the walls of his apartment. He had scrubbed everything. He had bleached the floors. He had thrown away his shoes, and the smell was still there, clinging to him like a second skin, and he could not get it out because it was not in the stone or the clothes or the apartment. It was in him. It was in his memory, and the memory would not wash away. The man's name was Spencer Hale. He was 31 years old. He was a structural engineer by trade, a man who understood load-bearing calculations and stress fractures and the tensile strength of steel. And he had been, before the trip, a man of methodical habits and dry humor and a quiet, self-contained competence that his colleagues respected and his friends found reassuring. He was the person you called when the foundation cracked. He was the person who knew how things held together and why they fell apart. He was not a man who sobbed in bathtubs with river stones. He was not a man who was afraid of the smell of fish. He had not been before the trip. The trip had been Nadia's idea. Nadia Wu, not the Nadia from the Zagros, a different Nadia, a different life, was a friend from university who had gone into environmental journalism and who had a gift for finding stories in the places that other people forgot. She had found the cannery in a dusty territorial archive in Juneau, a reference to a settlement called Tidewater, established in 1903 by a cannery company that had processed salmon from the rivers of the Tongass National Forest, until the runs dried up and the company went bankrupt, and the settlement was abandoned in 1927. The archive contained a single photograph, a cluster of wooden buildings on stilts, perched over a creek that ran through a narrow valley in the forest, surrounded by trees so tall and so dense that they blocked the sky. The photograph was labeled Tidewater Cannery, 1921. Below the label in pencil, someone had written, "Abandoned. Do not return." Nadia had been thrilled. Do not return was to her an invitation. She called Spencer and said, "I want to find this place. I want to write about it. I want you to come with me." Spencer had said, "Why me?" "Because you're an engineer. Because you understand structures. Because if we find the cannery, you can tell me how it was built and why it failed and what's left of it. And because you're the only person I know who won't complain about the rain." He had agreed because he was between projects and because Nadia was his friend, and because the Tongass National Forest in southeastern Alaska was, by all accounts, one of the most beautiful places on Earth, a vast, temperate rainforest of Sitka spruce and western hemlock, carpeted in moss and fern, threaded with rivers and streams, shrouded in fog and rain. It was also one of the most remote. The cannery, if it still existed, was deep in the forest, accessible only by boat or by foot, and the foot route was a 20-mile hike through old-growth timber and muskeg, and the kind of terrain that ate boots and sprained ankles and made maps obsolete. There were 5 of them: Nadia, the journalist; Spencer, the engineer; Leo Tanaka, a 22-year-old biology student who was Nadia's cousin and who had come because he was studying the ecosystem of the Tongass and needed field data; Maya Akafor, a photographer who had been on assignment in Alaska before and who carried her cameras in a waterproof pack that she treated with the reverence of a holy relic. And Dev Singh, a high school friend of Spencer's who had become a wilderness guide in British Columbia and who had agreed to come because he needed a break from guiding rich tourists up mountains, and because the idea of exploring an abandoned cannery appealed to the part of him that was still, despite everything, a boy with a flashlight and a sense of wonder. They flew to Juneau, took a bush plane to a fishing village called Salt Point, hired a boat to take them up the coast to the mouth of a river called Gray Creek, and began the hike. The boat captain, a grizzled man named Hank who had been fishing these waters for 40 years, dropped them at the river mouth and wished them luck in a tone that suggested he expected them to need it. He didn't say anything else. He didn't warn them. He just looked at the mouth of Gray Creek, the dark, slow water sliding out of the forest, the trees leaning over it like old men over a table, and he shook his head and turned the boat around and left. They hiked for 2 days. The forest was overwhelming. The trees were enormous. Sitka spruce 8 feet in diameter, western hemlock towering above them like cathedral columns, their trunks wrapped in moss and their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so dense that the light at ground level was a perpetual greenish twilight. The undergrowth was thick: salal, fern, devil's club with its spiny stems and broad leaves, skunk cabbage that smelled like its name. The ground was spongy, layers of moss and rotting wood and standing water that swallowed their boots to the ankle with every step. The air was wet, not raining exactly, but not raining, the moisture hanging in the air like a fog that clung to their skin and their clothes and their packs and made everything heavy and slow. They camped on the first night by a bend in Gray Creek. The creek was wide here, 30 feet across, and slow, its water dark with tannins and silt, its banks muddy and lined with the roots of spruce trees that reached down into the water like fingers. They set up their tents on a patch of higher ground, a small, flat rise of moss and gravel that Dev declared dry enough, and they built a fire and ate freeze-dried meals and talked about the cannery and what they might find. "If it's still there," Dev said, stirring his chili with a spork, "it's probably in bad shape. 20 miles from anything, 100 years of rain and rot. The stilts will be gone. The walls will be mushroom food. But the bones might be there, the pilings, the foundations, maybe some machinery, the kind of stuff that doesn't rot." "Steel doesn't rot," Spencer said. "Concrete doesn't rot. If they used reinforced concrete for the foundations, there could be substantial remains." Nadia was taking notes. The archive said the cannery processed salmon. There would have been canning machines, conveyor belts, a boiler house. The company was called Southeast Fisheries. They employed about 60 people at the peak. 60 people in the middle of nowhere, Maya said, adjusting her camera. That's a town. There would have been dormitories, a mess hall, maybe a school. The archive mentioned a school, Nadia said. 1 room, 10 students. The teacher was the manager's wife. She taught them to read and write and do arithmetic, and she also taught them how to can salmon, because the school was in the cannery building, and the children worked the line when the runs were heavy. They talked for another hour, the fire crackling, the creek gurgling, the forest pressing in around them like a living wall. Spencer was comfortable. He liked the woods. He liked the isolation. He liked the feeling of being in a place where the human footprint was temporary and the land was in charge. He wrapped himself in his sleeping bag and fell asleep to the sound of the creek and the wind in the spruce trees and the distant, rhythmic croaking of frogs. The guide appeared on the second day. They had been hiking for 4 hours, following Gray Creek upstream through a valley that was narrowing steadily, the walls of spruce and hemlock closing in on the water until the creek was a narrow, dark channel, and the trees were a wall on either side. The trail, if you could call it a trail, was a faint track through the undergrowth, marked by occasional blazes on tree trunks that were so old the bark had grown over them and they were nearly invisible. Dev was in the lead, navigating by GPS and by instinct, and he stopped suddenly and held up his hand. "Someone's ahead," he said. They stopped. Spencer looked past Dev and saw, standing in the creek 50 yards upstream, a man. He was wearing rubber waders and a plaid jacket and a baseball cap with the brim pulled low. He was standing in the water with a fishing rod, casting into a pool beneath a fallen log, and he was so still that Spencer had mistaken him for a tree stump. He was an old man, 60, maybe 70, with a weathered face and hands that looked like they had been carved from driftwood. He saw them watching and reeled in his line and waded to the bank. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was flat and nasal, the accent of southeastern Alaska, clipped vowels, swallowed consonants, the cadence of a man who talked to fish more than to people. "Afternoon," Dev said. "We're hiking up Gray Creek, looking for the old Tidewater cannery." The man looked at them, at their packs, their boots, their GPS units and water bottles and expensive waterproof jackets, and his expression didn't change. It was already the expression of a man who had seen something he didn't want to see and had arranged his face to show nothing. "I know where it is," he said. "I can take you to the creek, but I won't go past it." "Why not?" Nadia asked. The man looked at her. His eyes were pale blue and very clear, and there was something in them, not fear, not superstition, but a kind of wariness, the wariness of a man who has learned to trust his instincts about places. "Because past that creek the ground isn't right," he said. "I've been fishing this river for 30 years. I've been everywhere, every tributary, every bend, every pool. But I don't go past that creek. Something about it isn't right." "What do you mean, isn't right?" Spencer asked. The man was quiet for a moment. He looked at the creek, at the dark water sliding past, at the trees leaning over it. Then he looked back at them. "I'll tell you what I told the last group that came through here 3 years ago," he said. "If you hear someone you know calling from the tree line and that person is currently standing right next to you, do not look away from your friend." The group was silent. The forest was silent. Even the creek seemed to quiet, its water sliding past without sound, as though it were listening. "What does that mean?" Leo asked. He was the youngest, 22, with the earnest, open face of a student who still believed that the world was comprehensible and that warnings had explanations. "It means what it means," the man said. "I'm not going to explain it. I'm not going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you what I told the last group, and you're going to decide what to do with it." He paused. They didn't listen. 2 of them came back. They were different. Not hurt, different. They wouldn't talk about what happened. They just packed their gear and got on the first boat out and never came back. One of them, the woman, she was crying. Not the kind of crying where you've been hurt. The kind where you've seen something that you can't unsee. "Do you know what they saw?" Dev asked. "No," the man said. "And I don't want to. I know what I've seen. I've seen the otters." "The otters," Maya said. The man looked at her. His pale eyes were flat and unreadable. "You'll see," he said. "If you go past the creek, you'll see the otters, and you'll understand." He picked up his tackle box and his rod and waded back into the creek without another word. They watched him fish for a moment, the line cutting through the dark water, the man's body motionless except for the slow, rhythmic motion of his arm, and then they moved on. They reached the creek on the afternoon of the second day. It was a tributary, a narrow stream that came down from the north, joining Gray Creek at a bend where the valley widened slightly, and the trees thinned enough to let a patch of gray sky show through. The water was clear, not dark with tannins like Gray Creek, but clear and cold, running over a bed of flat, gray stones that looked polished. The banks were muddy and lined with moss-covered rocks, and the air smelled different here, sharper, cleaner, with a tang of salt that was odd for a freshwater stream so far from the coast. They camped on the bank. Dev checked the GPS and confirmed that the cannery was approximately 8 miles upstream from this point, following the tributary into a narrower valley that the map labeled simply unnamed. The trail, if it had ever existed, was gone. They would have to bushwhack. The evening was quiet. They set up camp, built a fire, ate. Spencer was sitting on a rock by the creek, cleaning his water filter when he saw the otter. It was on the opposite bank, about 20 feet away, sitting on a moss-covered stone at the water's edge. It was a river otter, sleek and brown, with a long body and a thick tail and small, bright eyes. Spencer had seen otters before in rivers in British Columbia and the streams of the Olympic Peninsula, and he knew their behavior. They were curious but cautious. They would watch you for a moment, then slip into the water and vanish. They didn't stay. They didn't approach. They didn't sit. This one sat. It sat on the stone and watched him, and it did not slip into the water. Spencer put down the water filter and looked at it more closely. Something was wrong. The otter was the right shape, the long body, the short legs, the thick tail, but the proportions were slightly off. The head was too large. The eyes were too wide. And the eyes themselves, Spencer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The pupils were vertical. Not round, like an otter's pupils should be, but vertical, like a cat's or a snake's, slit-shaped and black against the pale amber of the iris. They were too vertical to be animal and too wide to be human. They were something in between. "Hey," Spencer said softly. "Hey, Nadia, come look at this." Nadia came over and crouched beside him. The otter was still sitting on the stone, watching them. It hadn't moved. It was utterly still, its body poised in a way that was not the natural alertness of a wild animal but the deliberate, conscious stillness of something that was choosing not to move. Nadia raised her camera and took a picture. The otter didn't flinch at the shutter sound. It just watched. Is that normal?" Nadia asked. "For an otter?" "No," Spencer said. "Otters don't sit like that, and their pupils are round." "So what's wrong with that one?" Spencer didn't answer. The otter stood up, not on all fours, on its hind legs. It stood upright like a meerkat, its front paws hanging at its sides, its tail straight out behind it, and it watched them with those vertical pupils. It was the posture of a creature that was not an otter but was wearing an otter's body the way a person wears a coat, comfortably enough to pass at a distance, but wrong up close. The proportions were wrong. The joints were in the wrong places. The way it stood, the balance, the weight distribution, was not the way an otter stood. It was the way a human stood, adapted to a body that wasn't designed for it. "Okay," Nadia said, lowering her camera. Her voice was steady, but Spencer could hear the thin edge in it. "That's not normal." The otter watched them for another 10 seconds. Then it turned, slowly, deliberately, with a movement that was too controlled to be animal, and slipped into the water. It didn't splash. It didn't dive. It slid into the creek like a blade into a sheath, its body entering the water without a sound, and it was gone. The surface of the water was still. The stone where it had been sitting was empty. They stood there for a long moment, staring at the water. The creek gurgled. The fire crackled. The forest was dark and close and full of the sounds of evening birds, insects, the wind in the spruce trees. "Maybe it was a pet," Leo said from behind them. He had been watching from the camp. "Someone's pet otter that escaped. It got used to people." "Otters don't stand on their hind legs like that," Spencer said. "Some do, sea otters." "That wasn't a sea otter, and its pupils weren't round." Leo was quiet. The camp was quiet. The creek was quiet. And somewhere in the water, something was watching them with eyes that had pupils too vertical to be animal and too wide to be human. The fog came on the morning of the third day. Spencer woke to a world of white. The fog had come in during the night, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, like a door closing. It was thick and heavy and wet, a wall of vapor that erased the trees and the creek and the sky and reduced the world to a circle of visibility perhaps 10 feet across. Spencer could see the dying embers of the fire. He could see the shapes of the tents, dark lumps in the white. He could see his own breath mingling with the fog. Beyond that, nothing. The world had been erased. "Everyone up," Dev called. He was already outside his tent, packing his gear with the quick, efficient movements of a man who knew that conditions like this could be dangerous. "We need to move. If we wait for the fog to lift, we could be here for hours. The cannery is upstream. We follow the creek." They packed and moved. The hiking was slow. They walked single file, Dev in the lead, following the creek by sound. They couldn't see the water, but they could hear it, the gurgling, splashing sound of the stream running over its bed of flat stones, a constant, low murmur that was their only guide. The ground under their feet was soft and wet, the moss and mud and standing water of the forest floor, and every step was a negotiation with the terrain. They couldn't see where they were going. They couldn't see what was ahead. They could only hear the creek and follow it. After an hour, Spencer noticed something wrong. The creek was on the wrong side. They had been walking with the creek on their left, the north side, but now the sound was coming from the right. Spencer stopped and listened. Yes, the water was on the right. They had crossed it somehow, or it had crossed them. But there had been no crossing, no bridge, no wade. The creek had simply moved. "Dev," Spencer said, "the creek is on the wrong side." Dev stopped. He listened. He looked at his GPS, then at the fog, then at the creek. "That's not possible," he said. "We've been going straight. The GPS says we're on the north bank." "We're not. I can hear it on the right." Dev listened again. His face changed, a subtle shift, the kind of expression that crosses a man's face when something he has trusted stops working. "You're right," he said. "It's on the right, but the GPS says." He held up the unit and stared at it. The screen showed their position, a blue dot on a green map, the creek a blue line on their left, but the sound was on their right. The GPS and reality were disagreeing, and the disagreement was total. "Maybe we got turned around in the fog," Maya said. "Maybe we're walking in circles." "We're not walking in circles," Dev said. "I've been checking the compass. We've been heading northeast the whole time." "Then how is the creek on the wrong side?" No one answered. They stood in the fog and listened to the water, and Spencer felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear yet, but the precursor of fear, the awareness that something was not right. The geography was shifting. The creek was appearing in places it shouldn't be. The GPS and the compass were disagreeing with their senses. It was as if the land itself was rearranging, subtly, quietly in the fog where no one could see it move. "Let's keep going," Dev said. He sounded less confident now. "We follow the water. If the water is moving, we move with it. It has to lead somewhere." They kept going. The fog was thick and constant, a white world without reference points, and they moved through it like ghosts. The creek was on their right now, and they followed its sound, and the ground under their feet was soft and wet and smelled of mud, and something else. Something sharp and organic, like brine, like old fish, like the smell of a tide pool at low tide. Spencer noticed the smell and said nothing. He was beginning to understand that saying things, naming them, describing them, made them more real, and he didn't want this to be more real. Leo disappeared during the lunch stop. They had stopped to eat trail mix and jerky and water, eaten standing, the fog too thick to sit comfortably, and Leo had said he was going to look for firewood. "There might be deadfall under those spruces," he said, pointing into the fog. "I'll be right back." He walked into the white. They heard his footsteps on the moss, the soft, rhythmic crunch of boots on wet ground, and then they didn't. They waited. A minute, 2, 5. "Leo," Nadia called. Her voice disappeared into the fog, swallowed by the white, no echo, no return. "Leo, come back." Nothing, no answer, no footsteps. No sound except the creek and the wind and the faint, distant call of a bird. They searched. They spread out, staying within earshot of each other, calling Leo's name, their voices flat and small in the fog. They searched for 30 minutes, an hour, 90 minutes. They found nothing. No footprints, the moss was too dense and too wet to hold tracks. No broken branches, no scrapes of clothing on bark, no sign that anyone had passed this way. Leo had walked into the fog and vanished. Then Nadia found the boot. It was sitting on a rock by the creek. One boot, a hiking boot, size 9, the laces still tied. It was Leo's boot. Nadia recognized it because she had bought it for him, his birthday the previous month, a pair of Merrill Moabs from REI. She picked it up and turned it over and saw that the inside was wet, not with water but with something thicker, a clear, viscous fluid that smelled like rotting shellfish. The smell was immediate and overwhelming, a wave of brine and decay that hit Spencer like a physical force and made him gag. Nadia dropped the boot. It hit the rock with a wet slap, and the viscous fluid ran out of it and down the side of the rock and into the creek, where it dissolved into the water and disappeared. They found the trail next. A line of slime, clear, thick, glistening, running from the rock along the ground toward the creek. It was like a snail trail but wider, and the smell that rose from it was the same smell, rotting shellfish, brine, the organic stink of something that lived in water and ate things that lived in water. The trail led to the edge of the creek and disappeared into the current. "He's in the water," Dev said. His voice was flat. "Something took him into the water." "What?" Nadia said. She was shaking. Her face was white and her hands were trembling, and her voice had the thin, brittle quality of a person who is holding it together by force of will and knows that the force is about to fail. "What took him?" No one answered. They stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the water, the dark, clear water running over its bed of flat stones, the surface undisturbed, the current steady and smooth. There was no sign of Leo. There was no sign of anything. The creek looked the same as it always had, peaceful, ordinary, a stream running through a forest. But something was different. The sound had changed. The gurgling, splashing murmur that they had been following all day had been replaced by something else, a lower sound, a hum, a vibration that Spencer could feel in his feet through the ground. It was the sound of something in the water, not the water itself, something in it, something large and alive and moving. "We need to go," Spencer said. "Now." "What about Leo?" Nadia said. "He's gone," Spencer said. He didn't want to say it. He didn't want to make it real. But it was real, and standing here wasn't going to change it. "Something took him. We need to get out of here." Dev was already moving. He had his pack on his shoulders and his machete in his hand, and he was heading upstream, following the creek, moving fast. Maya was behind him, her camera in its waterproof pack, her face gray. Nadia was last, looking back at the creek, looking at the water where Leo had gone, her mouth open, her eyes wide, her body shaking with the effort of not screaming. Spencer took her arm. "Move," he said. "We move, we find the cannery, we find shelter, we figure this out." They moved. The fog was thick. The creek was beside them on their right, humming with that low, organic sound. The forest was invisible, a presence without a shape, a wall of white on every side. They walked for another hour, then two, and the terrain changed, the ground rising, the trees thinning, the air getting colder. They were climbing. The valley was narrowing. The creek was getting smaller, its water running faster, and the sound of it, the ordinary, natural sound of water over stone, was back. The hum had faded. Whatever was in the water was behind them. Or beside them, or ahead of them. Spencer couldn't tell. The fog made direction meaningless. The world was a white room with a floor of moss and a wall of vapor, and they moved through it blindly, following the water, and the water went where it wanted to go. The cannery appeared out of the fog like a ghost, dark, skeletal, half consumed by the forest. Spencer saw it first, a vertical line in the white, a straight edge in a world of curves, the unmistakable geometry of something built by human hands. He stopped and pointed. There. They approached slowly. The structure materialized in stages, first the pilings, a row of creosote-blackened posts rising out of the creek like the ribs of a drowned animal, then the platform, a sagging lattice of rotting planks suspended above the water, then the walls, a patchwork of wooden boards and rusted sheet metal held together by nails and moss, and the slow, patient grip of the forest itself. The cannery was built on stilts, 30 or 40 pilings driven into the creek bed, supporting a platform that held the main structure and several outbuildings. The creek ran directly underneath the building, its water sliding past the pilings in a dark, steady current. The forest had been eating the cannery for 100 years, trees growing through the platform, roots wrapping around the pilings, moss covering the walls in a thick green pelt. But the bones were still there. The structure was intact. It was standing. "It's beautiful," Maya said. She had her camera out and was shooting, the dark shape of the cannery against the white fog, the pilings rising from the water, the moss-covered walls. Her voice was reverent. She was seeing the thing she had come to see, and for a moment the horror was displaced by the photographer's eye, by the instinct to capture and frame and preserve. "It's a death trap," Spencer said. The engineer in him had taken over, the cold, analytical part of his brain that assessed structures and calculated loads and identified failure points. He looked at the pilings and saw rot. He looked at the platform and saw decay. He looked at the walls and saw structural compromise. The building was standing, but it was standing by habit, not by design. One strong wind, one heavy snowfall, one more decade of rain and rot, and it would be in the creek. "We need shelter," Dev said. "Whatever is out there, it's in the water. The cannery is over the water. It might not be safe, but it's better than nothing." They climbed the platform. The planks were soft. Spencer's boot went through one on the first step, and he had to grab a piling to keep from falling. They moved carefully, testing each plank before putting weight on it, and made it to the main structure, a long, low building with a corrugated metal roof and walls of rough-sawn lumber. The door was gone, the frame rotted away, and they stepped through the opening into a dark, cavernous space that smelled of rust and mildew, and something older. A faint, fishy scent that Spencer recognized and wished he didn't. The interior was a ruin. The canning machines were still there, or what was left of them. Rusted hulks of iron and steel, their belts rotted away, their gears seized with corrosion, standing in a row along the south wall like monuments to a dead industry. The floor was wooden, laid over the platform, and it creaked and groaned under their weight. The ceiling was low, 8 feet, maybe 9, and the light that came through the gaps in the walls was gray and thin and cast long, strange shadows. There was a second story, a loft, accessible by a ladder where the dormitories would have been. Spencer could see the railings, the remains of bunks, the ghosts of a 100-year-old sleeping arrangement. "Okay," Dev said. He was standing in the center of the main floor, his machete in his hand, his face set. "We're here. We've found it. Now we need to figure out how to get out. The fog is too thick to navigate. We wait for it to lift. We stay inside. We stay away from the water." "The water is under us," Maya said. She was looking at the floor, the gaps between the planks, the spaces where the wood had rotted through, the dark, moving gleam of the creek visible beneath. "It's right down there." "The creature is in the water," Dev said. "Not in the building. We stay up here. We stay dry. We wait." Nadia was sitting against the wall, her arms around her knees, her face blank. She had not spoken since they found the boot. Spencer sat down beside her. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Leo was gone. The creek had him. The slime trail and the smell and the hum in the water were all the evidence they had. And the evidence pointed to something that Spencer couldn't name because naming it would make it real. And making it real would mean accepting that the world contained things that his engineering degrees and his structural calculations had no framework for. He sat with Nadia and listened. The creek ran beneath them, its water sliding past the pilings with a soft, constant murmur. The building creaked and groaned. The wind pushed against the metal roof, making it vibrate with a low, bass hum that Spencer felt in his chest. And beneath all of it, beneath the water and the wind and the creaking wood, there was something else. A sound that was almost inaudible, almost subsonic, a vibration that he felt in his teeth and his bones rather than heard with his ears. It was the hum. It was still there. It was in the water beneath the building, and it was patient. The night came slowly. The fog didn't lift, it thickened, pressing against the walls of the cannery like a living thing, seeping through the gaps in the boards and filling the interior with a cold, damp vapor that settled on their skin and their clothes and their gear. They built a fire on the main floor, A small, careful fire on a bed of sand that Spencer had scraped together from the creek bank, the smoke rising through the gaps in the roof and disappearing into the white. The fire gave light and a little warmth, but it couldn't touch the cold that was in the air, a cold that was not the temperature but the fog itself, the wet, heavy, pressing cold of a cloud that had settled on the earth and refused to move. Dev took first watch. He sat by the fire with his machete across his knees, his back to the wall, his eyes on the door. Spencer tried to sleep. He lay on the floor with his jacket as a pillow and his sleeping bag pulled up to his chin, and he stared at the ceiling, the corrugated metal, rusted and pitted, the light of the fire dancing on its surface, and he listened. He listened to the creak beneath the floor. He listened to the wind against the roof. He listened to the creak of the building, and the pop of the fire and the slow, steady breathing of Maya and Nadia sleeping beside him. And he listened for the hum. The hum was there, faint, constant, a vibration in the pilings transmitted through the platform and the floor and into his body through the sleeping bag. Something was in the water, something was beneath them. It was there in the dark in the current, and it was waiting. Spencer didn't sleep. He lay in the dark and listened and waited, and after a while, a long while, an hour, maybe two, the hum changed. It became louder, more insistent, and then it became something else. It became a sound, a rhythmic, mechanical sound, a throbbing, pulsing drone that rose and fell in a regular cycle. Thuka, 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 thuka. It was a sound Spencer knew. He had heard it 1,000 times in cities and on mountains and over water. It was the sound of a helicopter. "Dev," Spencer whispered, "do you hear that?" Dev was already alert. He was standing, his head tilted, his eyes on the fog. "Helicopter," he said. "Someone's looking for us." "Already?" Maya said, sitting up. Her voice was hopeful, bright and sharp, with the desperate hope of a person who has been in the dark and hears the sound of rescue. "They must have sent a search team from Salt Point. Hank must have called it in when we didn't come back." "Or Leo made it out," Nadia said. Her voice cracked on Leo's name, and she pressed her hands to her face. The hope in her voice was painful, a thing so fragile that Spencer wanted to reach out and protect it, to hold it in his hands and keep it from breaking. The sound was louder now. Thuka, 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 thuka. It was coming from the south, from downstream, from the direction of the coast. It was getting closer. Spencer could feel it in the floor, the vibration of the rotors, transmitted through the air and the building and the ground. It was real. It was a helicopter. Someone was coming. "We need to signal them," Dev said. He was already moving, grabbing branches, piling them on the fire, building it up. "Flares. Do we have flares?" "In the emergency kit," Spencer said. He was on his feet, digging through his pack, his hands shaking with adrenaline and hope. He found the flare gun, a small orange pistol with a single cartridge, and he loaded it and went to the window. The sound was very close now. Thuka, 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 thuka. It was directly outside to the south, hovering. Spencer leaned out the window and looked into the fog. He couldn't see anything. The fog was thick, impenetrable, a wall of white. But the sound was there, right there, 50 feet away, and it was the sound of salvation. He raised the flare gun and fired. The flare arced into the fog, a bright red streak that disappeared into the white after 20 feet. He waited. The sound was still there. Thuka, 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 constant, steady, hovering. "Can they see us?" Maya shouted. She was at the other window, shining her flashlight into the fog, the beam cutting a pale cone through the vapor. "Can they see the flare?" "Keep the fire going," Dev said. He was piling wood on the flames, and the fire was roaring now, sending a column of smoke and sparks up through the roof. "They'll see the smoke. They'll see the light." The sound didn't change. Thuka, 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 thuka. It was still there, still hovering, still coming from the same direction. Spencer listened. He listened hard, with the focused, analytical attention of an engineer listening to a machine, and something shifted in his perception. Something that had been wrong about the sound became clear. The rhythm. The rhythm was too regular. A helicopter's rotors varied. The pitch changed, the speed fluctuated, the sound shifted as the pilot adjusted the collective and the cyclic. This sound didn't vary. It was a perfect, unvarying drone, a mechanical heartbeat that never faltered, never quickened, never slowed. It was not a helicopter. It was the sound of something imitating a helicopter. "Stop," Spencer said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the fire and the shouting and the throbbing drone like a blade. "Stop. Everyone stop." Dev looked at him, Maya looked at him, Nadia looked at him. "That's not a helicopter," Spencer said. The words hung in the air. The fire crackled. The sound continued, thuka 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 thuka, and Spencer listened to it with new ears and understood what it was. It was not rotors. It was not an engine. It was friction. It was the sound of something thick and rough being rubbed against wood, against the pilings of the cannery, against the wooden posts that supported the building, against the structure itself. It was fur. Thick, wet fur being dragged across the surface of the wood, and the texture of the fur against the grain of the wood was producing a rhythmic, mechanical drone that sounded, to a desperate, hopeful ear, exactly like a helicopter. The creature was underneath them. It was rubbing itself against the pilings. It was luring them. Maya's flashlight was pointed at the floor. In its beam through the gaps between the planks, Spencer could see the water beneath the building. And in the water he could see the pilings. And on the pilings, wrapped around them, pressed against them, moving slowly and rhythmically, he could see the shape of something large and dark and wet. It was the size of a man. It had the general form of an otter, long, sleek, brown-furred, but the proportions were wrong, all wrong. The body was too long. The limbs were too thin. The head was too large. And the hands that gripped the piling, that pressed against the wood, that rubbed and rubbed and rubbed, were not paws. They were hands, webbed, elongated, with fingers that were far too long, far too jointed, far too human. And they were rubbing the fur against the wood with a slow, deliberate, mechanical motion that produced the sound that had almost lured 4 people to their deaths. Maya screamed. The sound, the thuka 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 thuka, stopped. The creature beneath the building stopped rubbing. There was a moment of absolute silence. The fire, the fog, the building, the water, everything frozen, and then the creature moved. Spencer saw it through the gap in the floor. A dark shape sliding off the piling and into the water, its body entering the current with a sinuous, fluid grace that was terrifying in its smoothness. It was in the water. It was gone. And the silence that followed was the worst sound Spencer had ever heard. "It's underneath us," Spencer said. "It's in the water under the building. It was making the sound. It was mimicking a helicopter." "How?" Dev said. His voice was controlled, but Spencer could see the fear in his eyes, the deep, animal fear of a man who has just learned that the world is not what he thought it was. How does an animal mimic a helicopter? "It's not an animal," Nadia said. She was sitting against the wall, her arms around her knees, her face white. "It's a Kushtaka. The guide, Hank, he didn't say the name, but I know it. I've been researching the Tlingit legends. The Kushtaka, the shapeshifter, the land otter man. It's a creature from Tlingit mythology, a being that can take the form of a human or an otter, that lives in the water, that mimics voices and sounds to lure people away from safety. It doesn't kill for food. It takes people. It drowns them, or it takes them and makes them like itself." "That's a myth," Dev said, but his voice had no conviction. He was holding the machete in front of him like a talisman, the blade catching the firelight, and his eyes were on the floor, on the gaps, on the water, on the dark. "Myths don't rub themselves against pilings and sound like helicopters," Spencer said. "Myths don't have vertical pupils and stand on their hind legs and lure people into the water by calling their mother's name." The fire was dying. The wood was running out. Spencer looked at the pile of fuel they had gathered, a small heap of broken planks and dead branches that would last another hour, maybe 2, and he felt the cold pressing in. The fog was inside the building now, seeping through every gap and crack, and the temperature was dropping. They were in a rotting cannery, suspended over a creek, in a fog so thick they couldn't see 10 feet, with something in the water beneath them that could mimic any sound it had ever heard. "The floor," Spencer said. He was looking at the planks, at the gaps, at the rot, at the places where the wood had failed and the water was visible beneath. "It can get through the floor. The gaps are wide enough. It can reach through." "Then we don't stay on the floor," Dev said. "We go up the loft." They climbed the ladder to the loft. It was a narrow space, 20 feet by 10, with a low, sloping ceiling and a railing along the open side that looked down on the main floor. The remains of the bunks were still there: wooden frames, rusted springs, moth-eaten mattresses that crumbled at the touch. They cleared a space in the center, away from the edges, and huddled together. Dev took the machete. Spencer took the flare gun, empty now, the single cartridge spent, but the metal barrel was heavy enough to serve as a club. Maya had her flashlight. Nadia had nothing. They sat in the dark and listened. The fire below was dying, the last coals glowing red, the heat fading, the light shrinking. The fog pressed in. The building creaked. The water murmured beneath them. And then, from the tree line outside the cannery, a voice. "Leo." It was Nadia's voice. Nadia, who was sitting beside Spencer in the loft, her arms around her knees, her mouth closed. But the voice was coming from outside, from the fog, from the trees. It was Nadia's voice, saying Leo's name, with the exact inflection of a woman calling for a lost cousin, worried, desperate, loving. "Leo, where are you? Come back, I'm right here." Nadia pressed her hands to her mouth. Her eyes were wide. She was hearing her own voice coming from the fog, and the voice was using the exact words she had used an hour ago when they had been searching for Leo. The creature had been listening. It had heard her calling, and now it was using her voice. "Leo, please, I can't find you, Leo." Maya grabbed Nadia's arm. "Don't answer it," she whispered. "Don't say anything, it's not you." "I know," Nadia said. Her voice was a thread. "I know it's not me." The voice continued. It called Leo's name over and over with variations, sometimes worried, sometimes angry, sometimes tearful. Each variation was perfect. Each was Nadia's voice, reproduced with a fidelity that was beyond mimicry, beyond imitation, beyond anything that a biological mechanism should be able to produce. It was as if the creature had recorded Nadia's voice and was playing it back, adjusting the emotion and the emphasis and the tone with the precision of a recording engineer. Then the voice changed. It was no longer Nadia's voice. It was a man's voice, low, warm, comforting. It was Dev's voice. "Guys, I found a way out. There's a trail on the other side of the creek. Come down, I'll show you." Dev was sitting right there. Dev was holding the machete, his face white, his mouth open, his eyes fixed on the fog outside the loft. The voice was his exact voice, his exact cadence, his exact accent, and it was coming from outside, from the trees, from the dark. "Don't listen to it," Dev said. His voice was hoarse. "That's not me, I'm right here, that's not me." The voice continued. "Come on, guys, the fog is lifting. We can make it to the coast by morning, let's go." It was perfect. It was Dev's voice, perfectly reproduced, with the exact blend of authority and reassurance that Dev used when he was guiding, when he was the person in charge, the person who knew the way, the person you trusted. Spencer felt the pull of it. He felt it in his legs, in his feet, in the muscles of his body that wanted to stand up and go to the window and look for the trail. The voice was so right, so accurate, so completely Dev that his body responded to it before his mind could override it. "Close your eyes," Spencer said. "Everyone, close your eyes and don't listen." "That's easy for you to say," Maya said. Her voice was shaking. "How do you not listen to something that sounds exactly like the person sitting next to you?" "You listen to the person next to you," Spencer said. "Not to the voice outside. The person next to you is real. The voice outside is a recording." The voices multiplied. Now there were two: Dev's voice and Nadia's voice, overlapping, calling from different directions, the words slightly different but the tone the same. "Come down, come outside, come to the water." Then 3, Leo's voice, high and young and scared. Guys, I'm hurt. I fell in the creek. Please help me. Then 4, Maya's voice, calm and professional. I can see the search helicopter. It's landing on the other side of the creek. We need to go now. Maya heard her own voice and put her hands over her ears. Stop it, she said. Stop it, stop it, stop it. The voices didn't stop. They continued through the night, calling, pleading, reasoning, weeping. They cycled through the entire repertoire of human emotion, using the voices of the 4 people in the loft, using the voice of Leo, using voices that Spencer didn't recognize but that Nadia did, her mother's voice, her father's voice, the voices of people she loved and trusted. The creature beneath the cannery had been listening. Not just for an hour, not just for a day. It had been listening for 100 years, to the cannery workers who had lived here, to the fishermen who had passed through, to the hikers and hunters and explorers who had ventured up Gray Creek and never come back. It had a catalog of voices, hundreds of them, thousands, and it played them all one after another, a chorus of the dead and the living, calling from the fog, calling from the water, calling from the dark. Dawn came as a rumor, a faint lightening in the fog, a shift from white to gray, a suggestion of shape in the formlessness. Spencer opened his eyes. He had not slept, had not even closed them for more than a few seconds at a time, and saw the world materialize around him. The cannery took shape, the walls, the ceiling, the main floor below the loft. The fog was still there, but it was thinner, the visibility extending to 30 feet, then 50. And for the first time in 18 hours, Spencer could see the ground outside the building, the muddy bank of the creek, the roots of the spruce trees, the flat gray stones of the creek bed. Everything was wet and gray and still. The voices had stopped at some point during the night. Spencer couldn't say when. They had faded gradually, the way a radio signal fades at the edge of its range, still present, still audible, but fainter and fainter until the silence swallowed them. The silence now was the kind that follows a long noise, the silence of a room after a concert, the silence of an ear after a bell. It was a silence with an afterimage, a silence that still hummed. Dev was asleep. He was sitting against the wall of the loft with his chin on his chest and his hands still wrapped around the machete, and he was snoring softly, a thin, ragged sound that was somehow the most reassuring thing Spencer had heard in 12 hours. Dev was alive. Dev was here. Dev was real. Maya was beside him, curled on her side, her camera clutched to her chest like a child. Nadia was awake. She was sitting at the edge of the loft, her feet dangling over the edge, staring down at the main floor. Her face was gray and lined, and she looked 10 years older than she had yesterday. She was mouthing something, silent, repetitive, a private litany that Spencer couldn't make out. Nadia, Spencer said softly. She didn't turn. I can still hear them, she said. Her voice was flat. Not the voices outside. Leo. I can hear Leo. He's calling me. He's been calling me all night. That's the creature, you know that. I know, but it sounds exactly like him. Exactly. Every inflection, every breath, every pause, it sounds more like Leo than Leo did. She turned to look at Spencer, and her eyes were red and wet and terrible. What if it's not mimicking? What if it's replaying? What if it took Leo and now it's playing back his voice from inside him? What if Leo is still alive in there somewhere and the creature is using his voice to call me? Spencer didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. The question was unanswerable, a loop of horror and grief and impossible biology that went around and came back to the same place. Something had taken Leo, and something was using his voice, and no one knew what that something was or how it worked or whether Leo was alive or dead or something else, something in between, something that the categories of life and death did not cover. We need to move, Spencer said. The fog is thinning. If we can see, we can navigate. We go back the way we came, downstream toward the coast. We find the trail. We get out. What about the creature? Maya said. She was awake now, sitting up, her eyes puffy and her face creased with the imprint of her camera strap. It's in the water. The trail follows the creek. We'd have to walk beside the water the whole way. Then we walk fast and we stay on the bank and we don't go near the edge, Spencer said. We have a compass. We don't need the GPS. We head south-southeast until we hit Gray Creek, then we follow Gray Creek to the coast. It's 20 miles. If we move fast, we can do it in 8 hours. And if the fog comes back, Dev said. He was awake now, standing, stretching, his face set in the hard, practical mask of a man who is pushing fear down into his stomach and bolting the lid. If the fog rolls in again, we're blind. We're walking beside the water with something in the water that can call us in by name. Then we don't stop, Spencer said. We don't stop for anything, we walk until we're out. They gathered their gear. They had little left, water bottles half empty, a bag of trail mix, the first aid kit, the flashlight, the machete, the empty flare gun, Maya's camera. They descended the ladder to the main floor. The fire was dead, a pile of gray ash and charred wood, cold to the touch. The building was dark and damp and smelled of rust and mildew and that other smell, the fish smell, the brine smell, the smell of the creature which was everywhere now, in the wood, in the air, in the pores of the floor. Spencer stepped over the ash pile and walked toward the door. The fog was thinner here, 10 meters of visibility, maybe more, and he could see the creek through the gaps in the platform. The water was dark and still. No movement, no hum. The creature was either gone or hiding. They stepped out of the cannery and onto the platform. The planks groaned under their feet. The fog was gray and wet but lifting, the ceiling rising, the trees emerging from the white in dark, dripping shapes. They crossed the platform, descended the ladder to the creek bank, and stood on the muddy ground. The creek was to their right, running south. The forest was to their left, a wall of spruce and hemlock. The trail, if it existed, was somewhere ahead, and they began to walk. They had been walking for 20 minutes when Maya stopped. She was in the rear, behind Dev, behind Nadia, behind Spencer, and she stopped because she had heard something. Not from the water, from the trees. "What is that?" she said. They stopped, they listened. The forest was making a sound. It was a faint, rhythmic sound, a scratching, a scraping, a sound like fingernails on bark. It was coming from the left, from the tree line, and it was moving. It was keeping pace with them. Something was in the trees, parallel to their path, walking with them. "Keep moving," Dev said. "Don't stop, don't look." They moved faster. The scratching sound continued, matching their pace, coming from the trees. It was behind them now, behind Maya, behind the group, and it was getting closer. Spencer could hear something else beneath the scratching, a wet sound, a breathing sound, a sound like air being pulled through a narrow passage. The creature was there. It was in the trees. It was following them. Maya began to run. She didn't decide to run, her body decided for her, the flight response overriding everything, and she was sprinting along the creek bank, her boots splashing in the mud, her pack bouncing on her back. Dev shouted after her, "Maya, don't run, stay together." But she was gone, swallowed by the fog, her footsteps fading into the white. The scratching in the trees accelerated. It was faster now, louder, moving toward the point where Maya had disappeared. Something heavy crashed through the underbrush, a branch snapping, a bush tearing, and then a sound that Spencer would hear for the rest of his life. Maya's scream. It was not a movie scream, not a sustained, dramatic shriek. It was a short, sharp, percussive sound, the sound of a person being hit, the air driven out of their lungs by impact. Then a wet, tearing sound, then a gurgle, then nothing. They ran, all of them. They ran along the creek bank, their boots crashing through the mud and the standing water, the fog closing around them. Spencer ran with Nadia's arm in his hand, pulling her, her feet barely touching the ground. Dev was ahead, the machete in his hand, cutting through the undergrowth that encroached on the path. They ran for 3 minutes, 5, 10, and then the fog swallowed them again, thick and heavy and white, the visibility dropping to nothing, the world erased. They stopped because they couldn't see. They stood in the fog, panting, gasping, their hands on their knees, their hearts hammering. The creek was beside them, they could hear it, the steady murmur of water over stone, but they couldn't see it. The trees were around them, they could smell them, the sharp, resinous scent of spruce, but they couldn't see them. They were blind again. "Maya," Nadia said, her voice was a whisper, "we left her." "She's gone," Dev said, his voice was hard. Whatever got her, it got her. We can't go back, we go forward. We can't just leave her. We have to. If we go back, we die. We go forward, we find the trail, we get out. We send people back for her. You don't send people back for someone who's been taken by that, Spencer said. His voice was flat. He was stating a fact. He didn't like the fact, but it was a fact. She's gone. The creature took her. The way it took Leo. If we go back, it takes us too. Nadia was silent. The fog was thick. The creek was murmuring. And then from the water, from the creek, from the dark, slow current that ran beside them, a new sound. It was Maya's voice. Maya's voice calling from the water, clear and calm and perfectly inflected. Guys, I'm okay. I fell in the creek, but I'm okay. Help me out, please. Maya was dead. Spencer had heard her die, the impact, the tearing, the gurgle. She was dead, and her voice was coming from the water, and it was perfect. It was Maya's voice, her exact tone, the precise blend of vulnerability and composure that Maya had used when she was in trouble but didn't want to make a fuss. The creature had taken her, and it had taken her voice, and now it was using it. Don't listen, Spencer said. Move south, follow the water. They moved. The fog was their enemy now, thick, blinding, a white wall that reduced the world to a sphere of 5 feet. They walked by the sound of the creek, keeping the water on their right, and they moved as fast as they could without running, because running meant noise, and noise meant the creature could find them, and the creature was faster than they were in the fog. Maya's voice continued from the water, calling, pleading, reasoning, and then it was joined by Leo's voice, and then by Nadia's voice, and then by voices they didn't know, men's voices, women's voices, children's voices, all calling from the creek, all saying the same thing, help me. I'm here. I'm in the water. Help me out. Dev went next. He was in the lead, cutting through the undergrowth, the machete swinging in short, efficient strokes, and he was fast and strong and competent, and he was doing everything right. He was being the guide, the person in charge, the person who knew the way, the person who would get them out. And then he wasn't. The creek moved. It had been on their right, Spencer could hear it, the constant murmur of water, and then it was on their left. The same shift they had noticed on the first day, the same impossible repositioning of the water. Dev stopped. He looked at the creek, now on the wrong side, and he turned to Spencer and said, "It's doing it again. The water is." The creature came out of the creek. Spencer didn't see it clearly. There was a blur of dark, wet fur, a flash of white teeth, a sound like a branch breaking, and Dev was gone. The machete fell to the ground. The undergrowth where Dev had been standing was flattened, and there was a trail, a wide, smeared trail of mud and slime leading from the path to the creek, and the creek was churning, its surface disturbed by something large and fast moving beneath it. Dev didn't scream. There was no scream. There was the sound of the undergrowth breaking and the splash of something heavy hitting the water, and then nothing. Dev was gone. Spencer and Nadia stood in the fog. They were alone. The creek was on their left, murmuring, and the fog was thick, and the voices were coming from the water. Dev's voice now added to the chorus. "Guys, the water isn't deep. I can touch the bottom. Come on in, it's fine, it's warm." Nadia was shaking. Her whole body was shaking, a fine, continuous tremor that made her teeth chatter. Spencer grabbed her shoulders. "Look at me," he said. "Look at me. We're going to walk. We're going to follow the compass. We're going to go south-southeast, and we're not going to stop, and we're not going to listen to anything. Not anything. Do you understand?" "Dev," Nadia said. Her voice was barely audible. "Leo, Maya, they're gone. We can't help them. We can only help ourselves. We walk now." He took the compass from his pack. The needle was steady, pointing south, reliable, the one instrument that still worked, the one thing in this forest that hadn't been rearranged or corrupted or turned against them. He held it in front of him and began to walk. Nadia followed, her hand on his pack, her head down. They walked through the fog, through the undergrowth, through the standing water and the mud and the moss, and they didn't look at the creek, and they didn't listen to the voices. The voices were getting worse. The creature or creatures Spencer didn't know there might be more than one was cycling through its catalog at a frantic pace as if it knew its prey was escaping and was throwing everything it had at them. Nadia's mother, Leo's father, Dev's girlfriend, Maya's sister. Voices that were perfect and warm and real, calling from the water, calling from the trees, calling from the fog. Come back, I'm here, I'm hurt, I'm cold, I need you, come back, come back. Nadia was crying, silent tears running down her face, her jaw clenched, her eyes fixed on Spencer's back. She was holding on. She was holding on by her fingernails, by the thread of her will, by the single, stubborn fact that she was alive and the voices were not the people they claimed to be. But the thread was fraying. Spencer could hear it in her breathing, the hitch, the catch, the moment in each breath where she almost broke, where the grief and the terror and the exhaustion nearly overwhelmed her, and then the breath continued and the thread held and they kept walking. Spencer was not holding on by a thread. Spencer was holding on by the compass. The compass was his anchor, the small, brass, liquid-filled instrument that pointed south regardless of the fog or the voices or the moving creek. He fixed his eyes on the needle and walked, and the needle didn't move, and the world might be falling apart around him, but the needle was steady, and steady was the only thing that mattered. Then the creek moved again. It was in front of them now, not beside them, but ahead, the sound of water directly in their path. They couldn't go forward without crossing it, and the water was making the hum again, the low, organic, subsonic vibration that Spencer felt in his teeth. The creature was in the water. It was in front of them. It was between them and the way out. Left, Spencer said. We go left, away from the water. They turned left, away from the creek. The ground rose, the slope of the valley wall, the root-heavy, moss-covered incline that led up to the ridge. They climbed. The fog was thinner on the slope. The trees were shorter here, the canopy broken, and Spencer could see 20 feet, 30, 50. He could see the trunks of the spruce trees, gray and wet. He could see the ground, a tangle of roots and moss and fern. He could see Nadia behind him, her face gray, her eyes red, her mouth set in a line. And he could see, for a moment, the creature. It was standing at the base of the slope. It was in the fog, but it was close enough to see, 30 feet, maybe 40, and it was standing upright. It was the size of a man. Its body was long and dark and wet, covered in fur that was matted and slicked with water. Its head was too large, its eyes too wide, its pupils vertical slits that caught the gray light and reflected it back with a pale, amber gleam. Its arms were too long, its fingers webbed and elongated, reaching almost to its knees. And its tail, it had a tail, a thick, muscular tail that dragged behind it on the ground, leaving a trail in the moss. It was not an otter. It was not a man. It was something in between, a hybrid, a glitch, a thing that had tried to be two things at once and had failed at both. Its skin was too tight. Spencer could see the muscles and the bones beneath it, the anatomy of a creature that was wearing a shape that didn't fit, that was stretched and distorted and wrong. And it was not speaking. It was playing back. From its mouth, its humanish mouth, with its too wide lips and its too many teeth, came the sound of Dev's voice and Maya's voice and Leo's voice all at once, overlapping, distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. It was a machine. It was a recorder. It was a thing that consumed voices and played them back, and it was standing at the bottom of the slope, watching them climb, and it was calling them with the voices of their dead friends. Nadia saw it. She saw it and she stopped climbing and she stared at it, and her face went through every expression that a human face can make: horror, grief, recognition, disbelief, and finally, a kind of resignation, as if she had known all along that this was what was waiting for them, and the only surprise was how wrong it looked, how completely and fundamentally wrong, like a word spelled correctly but pronounced in a way that made it unrecognizable. "Keep climbing," Spencer said. "Don't look at it, keep climbing." Nadia turned away. She climbed. Spencer climbed. The creature stood at the bottom of the slope and watched them, and the voices played on, a distorted, overlapping chorus of the dead, calling from the mouth of something that had never been alive in any way that mattered. The ridge was narrow, a spine of moss-covered rock that ran along the top of the valley wall, with the forest falling away on both sides. Spencer could see now in the thinner air above the fog. Below them, the valley was a sea of white, the fog filling it like a bowl, dense and still, with the tops of the tallest spruce trees poking through like dark fingers. The creek was invisible, buried under the vapor, but Spencer could hear it. He could always hear it, and beneath the sound of the water, the hum. The creature was still down there. It was in the fog, in the water, and it was waiting. Nadia was sitting on the ridge with her back against a tree, her knees drawn up, her face in her hands. She was not crying anymore. She was past crying. She was in the place beyond tears, the gray, flat, emptied place where the body runs out of grief and the mind runs out of fear, and what's left is a kind of numbness that is not peace but the absence of the capacity to feel. Spencer recognized it. He had seen it in the eyes of survivors on the news, earthquake survivors, war survivors, the survivors of things that exceed the mind's ability to process. The eyes go flat. The face goes still. The person is there technically, but the inner room is empty. Spencer was not numb. He was the opposite of numb. He was hyper-aware of the fog below, of the trees around them, of every sound and every smell and every shift in the light. His senses were running hot, overclocked by adrenaline, processing the world at a resolution that was almost painful. He could hear the individual drops of moisture falling from the spruce needles. He could smell the moss and the bark and the resin, and beneath it all, the faint, constant, maddening smell of old fish. The creature's smell. It was on him. It was on his clothes, on his skin, in his hair. He could smell it on Nadia, too, and on the air and on the rocks. It was everywhere. It was the smell of the valley, the signature scent of the thing that lived in the water and ate voices and wore shapes that didn't fit. He had to think. The fog was below them. The ridge was above the fog. If they stayed on the ridge, they could see. They could navigate. They could walk south along the ridge until they found a descent that brought them down on the far side of the fog, closer to the coast. The compass was still working. The ridge was clear. The creature was in the water, and the water was in the valley, and the valley was below the fog. They were safe, temporarily, provisionally, in the way that a man on a rooftop is safe from a flood, safe until the water rises. The ridge, Spencer said. We follow it south. We stay above the fog. We walk until we find a way down that doesn't go through the water. Nadia looked up. Her face was gray. How far? 10 miles, maybe less, maybe more. I don't know, but we can see from up here. We can navigate. And the creature is in the water. It can't get up here. It stood up, Nadia said. Her voice was flat. It stood on its hind legs. It climbed. It's in the water. It belongs in the water. The ridge is dry. It won't come up here. He didn't know if this was true. He was saying it because it needed to be said, because Nadia needed to hear it, because the alternative, admitting that the creature could go anywhere it wanted, that the fog and the water and the trees were all its domain and there was no safe ground, would mean that there was no plan and no hope and no point in walking, and if they stopped walking, they were dead. They walked. The ridge was clear, a narrow path of rock and moss and short, stunted trees, the kind of vegetation that grows at altitude in a temperate rainforest, windswept and hard. The fog was below them, filling the valley, and the sky above was gray and overcast and featureless. The air was cold and wet and tasted of salt, salt from the ocean, carried inland by the wind, mixing with the smell of the forest and the smell of the creature. Spencer walked with the compass in his hand, checking it every minute, keeping them on a south-southeasterly heading. Nadia walked behind him, silent, her eyes on his boots. They walked for an hour, then 2. The ridge was steady, a reliable highway of stone, and they made good time. The fog below them didn't change. It sat in the valley like a lake, still and dense, and the creek was somewhere under it, murmuring, humming. Spencer listened for the hum and heard it, faint, constant, a vibration that came through the rock of the ridge and into his feet. The creature was down there. It was following them. It was moving through the water, through the fog, keeping pace, waiting for them to come down. The voices started again on the third hour. They came from below, from the fog, from the valley, and they were clear and distinct, rising through the vapor like smoke. Leo's voice, Maya's voice, Dev's voice, calling their names, calling for help, calling for them to come down. Spencer set his jaw and kept walking. Nadia pressed her hands over her ears and kept walking. The voices followed them along the ridge, relentless, patient, perfect in every detail, a chorus of the dead calling from the fog. Then Nadia stopped. She pulled her hands from her ears and turned toward the valley. "Mom," she said. Spencer turned. Nadia was standing at the edge of the ridge, looking down into the fog. Her face had changed. The numbness was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded, the face of a child hearing her mother's voice from a dark room. She was listening. She was leaning toward the sound. "Nadia, that's not your mother." "It sounds exactly like her, exactly. She's saying my name. She's saying, 'Nadia, come down, I'm here, I've come to find you.'" "It's the creature. It heard you talk about your mother, it's using her voice." "How did it hear me talk about my mother? I haven't." "You talked about her on the boat, on the hike, in camp. It's been listening since we got here. It's been listening to everything." Nadia's face crumpled. The grief and the fear and the exhaustion and the voice of her mother, all of it, hitting her at once, and Spencer saw the thread that had been holding her together, the thread of will and stubbornness and the refusal to die, snap. She took a step toward the edge. Spencer grabbed her. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and pulled her back from the edge and held her. She fought him, not with strength but with the limp, boneless resistance of a person whose body has stopped cooperating with their survival instincts. She was trying to go down. The voice was calling her, and it was her mother's voice, and it was perfect, and Spencer was the only thing between her and the fog. "Don't let go," she whispered. "Don't let go of me, I can hear her. I can hear my mom. She's down there, she's calling me." "She's not down there. Your mother is in Seattle. Your mother is at home. The thing in the fog is not your mother." I know she's not, but it sounds like her. It sounds more like her than she does." Nadia's voice broke. "How does it sound more like her than she does?" Spencer didn't answer. He held her. The voice from the fog continued, Nadia's mother's voice, warm and loving and concerned, calling Nadia's name, saying the things that a mother says to a frightened child. "It's okay. I'm here, come to me, I'll keep you safe." The words were perfect. The emotion was perfect. And the perfection was the horror, because no animal, no mechanism, no biological system should have been able to produce that level of fidelity. The creature had not just recorded the voice. It had understood it. It had parsed the emotional content and reproduced it with a precision that exceeded the original, as if it had distilled the essence of maternal love and fear and concern and amplified it, purified it, made it more real than reality. It was a lore that worked not because it was deceptive, but because it was true, true to the memory, true to the emotion, true to the deepest, most primal need that a human being can feel, the need to be found by someone who loves you. Spencer held Nadia until the voice faded. It faded slowly, the way the other voices had faded, the volume dropping, the words blurring, the emotion flattening, until it was a murmur and then a hum and then silence. Nadia stopped fighting. She went limp in his arms, and he lowered her to the ground and sat beside her, his back against the tree, and he held her and waited for the shaking to stop. They found the trail on the 5th hour. It was a faint track, not the trail they had hiked in on, but a different one, older, overgrown, cutting down the south side of the ridge through a stand of hemlock. Spencer could see the ground at the bottom, a flat, mossy expanse that looked dry, that looked clear, that looked like it might connect to the main trail that led to the coast. The fog was not present on this side of the ridge. The wind had pushed it to the north, and the south slope was visible, gray and wet but open. They could see the trees. They could see the ground. They could see the way down. "Okay," Spencer said. "We go down, we follow this trail. If it connects to the main trail, we follow that to the coast. If it doesn't, we bushwhack south until we hit the river. Either way, we're going down. And once we're down, we don't stop. We walk. We walk until we hit Salt Point." "What about the creature?" Nadia said. She was sitting on a rock, her face gray but her eyes clear. The episode on the ridge had burned something out of her. The numbness was gone, replaced by a hard, bright, terrible clarity. She was seeing the world as it was, without the comfort of disbelief, and the seeing had made her strong in the way that only the truly desperate can be strong. "If it comes, it comes. We can't fight it. We can't outrun it. All we can do is walk. And if we walk fast enough and far enough, maybe we get out before it catches us." They went down. The trail was steep and slippery, the moss and the wet rock making every step a negotiation. They descended for 30 minutes, the trees closing around them, the fog staying above on the ridge. The ground at the bottom was flat and dry, a mossy glade surrounded by hemlock with the faint track of the old trail running south. Spencer checked the compass. South. They followed the trail. They had been walking for 20 minutes when the fog came back. It came from the south, a wall of white rolling up the valley like a tide, fast and thick and total. One minute they could see 50 feet, the next 5. The world was erased. The trail was gone. The trees were gone. The ground was gone. They were standing in white. "No," Spencer said. "No, no, no." The hum started immediately. The low, subsonic vibration that meant the creature was near, that it was in the water, that it was coming. Spencer couldn't see the water. He couldn't see anything. But he could hear it, the creek, somewhere to the east, the murmur of water over stone, and beneath it the hum. Then the voices, all of them at once. Leo, Maya, Dev, Nadia's mother, Spencer's father, voices he knew and voices he didn't, all calling from the fog, all saying his name, all saying Nadia's name, all saying, "Come here, come to me, I'm here, I'm safe, come to the water." Spencer closed his eyes. He thought about the guide's warning. If you hear someone you know calling from the tree line and that person is currently standing right next to you, do not look away from your friend. He opened his eyes and looked at Nadia. She was standing 2 feet away, her face white, her eyes wide, her mouth open. She was hearing the voices too. She was hearing her mother, her father, Leo, all of them, all at once. "Nadia," Spencer said, look at me, don't look away." She looked at him. Her eyes were locked on his, and he could see the terror in them, the absolute, bottomless terror of a person who is standing in the dark with something that is calling to her with the voices of everyone she has ever loved, and who knows that if she looks away, if she breaks eye contact for even a second, she will go to the voice. She will walk into the fog. She will walk to the water, and she will never come back. "I'm not going to look away," she said. Her voice was a whisper. "Don't you look away either." I won't look away." They stood in the fog, face to face, eye to eye, and the voices screamed at them from the white. They were loud now, not calling but shouting, pleading, weeping, begging. The full emotional spectrum of human desperation played back at maximum volume from every direction. The creature was not holding back. It was throwing everything it had at them, the entire catalog, the full repertoire, every voice it had ever collected, every emotion it had ever distilled. The fog was full of sound, and the sound was full of love, and the love was a trap. Spencer had an idea. It was not a good idea. It was a desperate idea, the kind of idea that comes to a person when all the good ideas have been used and the bad ideas are all that's left. The voices were the weapon. The creature used sound to find them, to track them, to lure them. If it couldn't hear, if the sound was cut off, it couldn't find them. It couldn't lure them. It couldn't call them. "The ears," he said. "We block our ears. If we can't hear the voices, they can't call us." "Block our ears with what?" "Mud, wax, anything. The mud on the ground, pack it in your ears, do it now." Nadia knelt. She scooped mud from the ground, thick, wet, gray mud, and packed it into her ears, pressing it in with her fingers until the sound faded. Spencer did the same, pushing the mud deep into his ear canals, feeling the world go muffled and distant. The voices didn't stop. They were still there, still screaming, still calling, but they were reduced. They were a buzz, a murmur, a sound at the edge of perception rather than a sound at the center. The mud was a wall, not a high wall, not a thick wall, but a wall. "Compass," Spencer said. His own voice was distant and muffled in his ears. "We follow the compass. We don't listen. We don't look at the fog. We look at the compass and we walk south." He held the compass in front of him. The needle was steady. South. He began to walk. Nadia put her hand on his pack and followed. They walked through the fog, through the voices, through the hum, and they did not stop. They walked with their heads down and their ears packed with mud and their eyes on the needle pointed south, and south was the way out. The creature followed. Spencer couldn't hear it, the mud blocked the hum and the voices, but he could feel it. The ground vibrated under his feet. Something was moving through the undergrowth to their left, keeping pace, its body heavy enough to shake the earth. It was there. It was close. And it was waiting for the mud to fall out, for the wall to break, for the voices to get through. It was patient. It had all the time in the world. They walked for 3 hours. The mud dried and crumbled and had to be replaced. They scooped fresh mud from the ground and packed it in and kept walking. The fog thinned. The trees thinned. The ground leveled out and became familiar, the wide, flat, moss-covered floor of the old-growth forest, the kind of terrain they had hiked through on the first day. They were getting close. Spencer could feel it, not in the compass, not in the GPS, but in the air. The air was warmer. The salt smell was stronger. The ocean was close. Then Nadia's hand tightened on his pack. She was pulling him, stopping him. He turned. She was pointing. Through the thinning fog ahead of them, 50 feet away, a shape was standing. It was the creature. It was blocking the trail. It was standing upright, its body long and dark and wet, its tail dragging on the ground, its webbed fingers hanging at its sides. Its eyes were fixed on them, those vertical pupils, those 2 wide irises, that amber gleam. It was not calling. It was not mimicking. It was just standing there, watching, waiting. Spencer looked at the compass. South. The creature was south, between them and the way out. He looked at Nadia. She was staring at the creature, her face rigid, her body trembling. The mud was in her ears. She couldn't hear the voices, but she could see the creature, and the seeing was almost as bad. The wrong proportions, the too tight skin, the glitchy shape of something that was trying to be 2 things and failing at both. "Left," Spencer said. "We go around through the trees." They turned left off the trail into the undergrowth. They pushed through salal and devil's club and fern, their boots sinking in the wet ground, their faces scraped by branches. The creature didn't follow. Spencer looked back and saw it standing where they had left it, still facing south, still watching the trail. It wasn't following them. It was waiting. It was waiting for them to come back to the trail, because the trail was the way out, and the way out went past the water, and the water was where it lived. They went around. It took an hour of brutal bushwhacking through undergrowth so thick that Spencer had to cut it with the machete. They came out on the other side of the creature's position and found the trail again. It was there, the same faint track running south, and the fog was lifting, the trees emerging, the sky showing through the canopy. They could see the trail and the trees and the ground, and ahead, the sound that Spencer had been waiting for, the sound that was better than any voice, better than any silence, better than anything the creature could produce, the sound of waves, the ocean, the coast. They ran. They ran down the trail, their boots pounding on the moss and the mud, the fog breaking apart around them, the trees flashing past. The waves were louder now, a steady, rhythmic crash that was the most natural, most real, most honest sound Spencer had ever heard. The ocean didn't mimic. The ocean didn't lure. The ocean was the ocean, vast and cold and indifferent, and it was the way home. They burst out of the tree line and onto the beach, a wide, flat stretch of gray sand and gray sky and gray water, the coast of southeastern Alaska, the edge of the world. The fog was behind them, sitting in the forest like a wall, and the beach was open and bright and cold. They could see the ocean, gray and choppy, the waves rolling in, the wind blowing salt spray across the sand. They could see, 1/2 mile to the east, the mouth of Gray Creek, its dark water sliding into the sea. And they could see, beached on the sand near the creek mouth, a boat. They ran for the boat. They ran along the beach, their boots splashing in the surf, the waves breaking at their feet. The boat was a small aluminum skiff with an outboard motor, and sitting in it, reading a paperback book, was a man Spencer didn't recognize. A young man, a fisherman in rubber boots and a rain jacket, who looked up as they approached, and whose expression shifted from boredom to alarm as he took in the sight of two mud-covered, wild-eyed, bleeding people sprinting toward him across the sand. "Help," Spencer said. He reached the boat and grabbed the gunwale and hung there panting, his legs shaking. "Please, we need to get to Salt Point, please." The fisherman looked at them. He looked at the fog behind them, the wall of white sitting on the tree line. He looked at the creek mouth, where the dark water slid into the sea. And his face did something that Spencer would remember. It went still. Not the stillness of surprise or confusion, but the stillness of recognition. The fisherman looked at the fog and the creek, and he knew. He didn't know the details. He didn't know about the creature or the voices or the dead friends. But he knew, in the way that the people of this coast knew, that the valley behind Gray Creek was not a place where people went, and that the people who came out of it were not the people who went in. "Get in," the fisherman said. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask about the others. He pulled the starter cord on the outboard motor and the engine coughed to life, and the boat slid off the sand and into the water, and Spencer and Nadia were in it, and they were moving, and the shore was falling away, and the fog was falling away, and the world was opening up, gray and cold and vast and safe. Spencer sat in the bottom of the boat and looked back at the shore. The fog was there, sitting on the trees, a wall of white. The creek mouth was there, its dark water sliding into the sea. And at the creek mouth, at the water's edge, standing on the wet sand, was a shape. It was small at this distance, a dark figure, human-sized, standing upright, watching them go. Spencer watched it for a long time. He watched it until the boat rounded the point and the shore curved away and the shape disappeared behind the land. And even then he watched. He watched the empty shore and the fog and the trees, and he knew that the shape was still there, still standing, still watching, still patient. It had let them go. It had let them go the way a cat lets a mouse go, not because it had lost interest, but because it knew the mouse would come back. Or because it knew the mouse would carry the smell. The smell of the water, the smell of the silt, the smell of old fish that was in his pores and his clothes and his memory, the smell that would not wash out, the smell that would bring him back to the creek someday, the smell that was the creature's mark. The fisherman's name was Kyle. He was 24 years old, he had been fishing these waters since he was 12, and he did not ask questions. He took them to Salt Point in 40 minutes, the outboard motor pushing the skiff across the gray water at a steady clip, the wind cold and salt and real. Spencer sat in the bow and watched the shore slide past, the rocky coast, the trees, the fog that clung to the land like a second skin, and he did not speak. Nadia sat in the stern beside Kyle, and she did not speak either. The silence between them was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who have too much to say and no language for it. What words could hold the shape of what they had seen? What sentence could contain the creature standing at the creek mouth, watching them go? What paragraph could carry the weight of Maya's scream and Dev's silence and Leo's boot full of slime? Language was a tool built for a world that made sense, and the world they had come out of did not make sense, and so language failed, and they were silent, and the boat moved across the water, and the shore fell behind, and the world was gray and cold and ordinary and safe. Salt Point was a cluster of buildings on a rocky point, a general store, a dock, a fish processing plant that was closed for the season, a row of houses that faced the water. Kyle pulled the skiff up to the dock and tied it off and helped them out of the boat. Spencer's legs almost buckled when he hit the dock, the solid, unmoving, man-made surface of treated lumber and steel bolts, and he had to grab a piling to stay upright. The world was solid. The dock was solid. The air was solid. Everything was solid and real and fixed, and it did not shift or rearrange or call his name from the fog. Kyle walked them to the general store. The owner, a woman named Doris who was 60 and broad and had the face of a person who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing, gave them coffee and blankets and a phone. She looked at their mud-caked clothes and their wild eyes and the gray, hollowed-out shape of their faces, and she didn't ask what had happened. She poured the coffee and set out a plate of donuts and said, "The troopers are in Juneau. I'll call them. They'll be here in a couple of hours." Spencer drank the coffee. It was hot and strong and sweet, and the taste of it, the real, ordinary human taste of coffee, was a line drawn between the world he had been in and the world he was in now. He was out. He was out of the valley. He was out of the fog. He was out of the reach of the thing in the water. He didn't believe this. He didn't believe it for a second. Nadia called her mother. She sat in the back of the store, behind a shelf of canned salmon and jars of herring, and she called her mother on the store's landline. And when her mother answered, when Nadia heard the real voice, the living voice, the voice that belonged to a woman sitting in a kitchen in Seattle and not to something standing at the mouth of a creek in Alaska, she broke. She collapsed. She slid off the chair and onto the floor and she wept, and the weeping was not the silent tears of the ridge but the full, racking, body-shaking sobs of a person who has been holding everything in and has finally reached a place where it can come out. Doris sat beside her and held her and said nothing. Spencer stood by the window and watched the fog on the mountains across the bay and listened to Nadia cry and thought about the sound of the creature playing back Nadia's mother's voice, the real voice and the false voice, the living voice and the dead voice. The mother in the kitchen and the mother in the fog. How had the creature made the false voice sound more real than the real one? How had it distilled the emotion and amplified it and made it more true than truth? Spencer didn't know. He didn't want to know. He wanted to go home. The troopers came. They arrived in a float plane that landed in the bay and taxied to the dock 2 Alaska State Troopers in brown uniforms, a man and a woman, both of them carrying the calm, competent, seen-it-all air of people who respond to emergencies in remote places as a matter of routine. They asked questions. Spencer answered. He told them about the trip, the cannery, the fog. He told them about Leo. He told them about Maya and Dev. He did not tell them about the creature. He did not tell them about the voices or the vertical pupils or the thing that rubbed its fur against pilings to sound like a helicopter. He told them that something had happened in the fog, that people had been separated and lost, and that the survivors had walked out. He told them what a search party would need: boats, dogs, a helicopter. He told them where to look. He did not tell them what they would find. He already knew what they would find. They would find the cannery. They would find the ruins and the rust and the rot. They would find Leo's boot. They would find the slime trail. They would find the gaps in the floor through which the water was visible. They would find the pilings that the creature had rubbed, and if they looked closely, they would find the fur, thick, wet, brown fur caught in the splinters of the wood. And if they looked in the water, they would find nothing. The creature would be gone. The creek would be empty. The water would slide over its bed of flat stones, and the flat stones would be gray and smooth and still, and there would be no sign of the thing that had lived there except the smell, the faint, persistent, maddening smell of old fish that got into everything and would not come out. The search lasted 3 days. They found the cannery. They found the boot. They did not find Leo or Maya or Dev. They found a scrap of Maya's jacket caught on a branch near the creek, a shred of red Gore-Tex, torn as if by something with great strength and no concern for the material. They found Dev's machete on the ground near the place where Spencer had last seen him, the blade notched and bent, the handle scraped with deep, parallel gouges that the troopers attributed to a bear's claws. They found the cannery's guest book, a water-damaged ledger from 1923 with names and dates and a final entry in pencil that read, "The creek has been restless. 3 men did not return from the second shift. The company has decided to close the operation. We are leaving. We will not come back." They did not find the creature. They did not find bodies. They did not find anything that their categories of evidence could contain. The troopers filed their report. 3 hikers lost in dense fog, presumed dead, cause unknown, search suspended due to weather. The report was a document that reduced the horror to a paragraph, the same way all such documents do, the same way the Zagros report would do, the same way the world always does, smoothing the surface, filling the cracks, making the unacceptable disappear into the acceptable. 3 hikers lost in fog. A tragedy. A cautionary tale. File it and move on. Spencer went home. He flew from Juneau to Seattle, and from Seattle he took a cab to his apartment. A small, clean, well-organized space in a brick building in a neighborhood where the streets were straight and the buildings didn't move and the air smelled of coffee and rain and car exhaust and nothing else. He unlocked his door. He stepped inside. He stood in the hallway and listened. The refrigerator hummed. The radiator ticked. A car passed outside. The sounds of the city, the real, human, mechanical sounds of civilization, filled the space, and they were loud and constant and ugly and beautiful, and Spencer stood in his hallway and breathed them in and felt, for the first time in 6 days, the tension in his chest begin to ease. He showered. He stood under the hot water for 20 minutes, letting it run over his face and his body and his hands, washing the mud and the sweat and the blood. There was blood on his hands, Dev's blood from when he had grabbed the machete off the ground. And he watched the water swirl down the drain, gray and brown and then clear, and he thought, I'm clean. I'm clean now, it's off me. And then the smell hit him, the smell of old fish, the smell of rotting shellfish, the smell of brine and silt and something deeper, something biological, something that was not the sea but was of the sea. It was coming from his skin, from his pores, from the water running over his body. He grabbed the soap, a bar of Irish Spring, green and clean and aggressively artificial, and he scrubbed. He scrubbed his arms, his chest, his legs, his face, his hands. He scrubbed until his skin was red and raw and the bar of soap was a nub. The smell didn't go away. It was in his nose, in his sinuses, in the back of his throat. It was in his hair. He shampooed 3 times. He used conditioner. He used body wash. He used the dish soap from the kitchen. The smell didn't go away. It was there, faint but persistent, a ghost scent that clung to him like a film, like a second skin that the water couldn't reach. He got out of the shower and dried off and dressed and sat on his couch and turned on the television. The news was on, a story about a bridge inspection in Portland, a story about an election in the Midwest, a story about the weather. The world was normal. The world was the world he had left 2 weeks ago, and it was unchanged, and it was safe, and it was boring, and Spencer sat on his couch and watched it and felt the distance between himself and it growing, the gap widening, the wall going up between the world that made sense and the world that didn't, and he knew. He knew with the same bone-deep certainty that had kept him walking on the ridge, that the wall would never come down. He had seen the other side. He had heard it. He had smelled it. And the seeing and the hearing and the smelling had changed him in a way that no amount of soap or coffee or television could reverse. He went to work. He sat in his office and looked at blueprints and ran calculations and attended meetings and did all the things that a structural engineer does. And he did them well, and no one noticed anything different about him except that he was quieter than before, that he didn't make jokes, that he ate lunch alone. His colleagues attributed this to the trauma of losing 3 friends in a hiking accident, and they were right, but only partially. The trauma was there, the grief, the guilt, the survivor's shame, but beneath it was something else, a stain. A psychological mark that the creature had left on him, the way it had left the smell of old fish on his skin. The creature hadn't just hunted them. It hadn't just killed their friends. It had touched him. It had reached into his mind with the voices of the dead and the loved, and it had left something there. A residue, an echo, a fragment of itself that was lodged in his memory like a splinter and would not come out. He couldn't stop thinking about the sounds. The voices, the hum, the helicopter that was fur on wood. They played in his mind, not as memories, not as recollections, but as present-tense experiences, as if they were happening now, in his apartment, in his office, in the street. He would be sitting in a meeting and suddenly hear Leo's voice calling from the water. He would be lying in bed and suddenly hear Maya scream. He would be walking down the street and suddenly hear the thuka 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 of the creature rubbing itself against the pilings. The sounds were not memories. They were echoes. They were the creature's final gift, a recording left in his mind, playing on a loop, a reminder that the thing in the water had touched him and that the touching was permanent. He started collecting stones. He didn't know why at first. He was walking home from work one evening, 3 weeks after the trip, 5 weeks after the trip, he had lost track, and he passed a landscaping supply store, and there was a bin of river stones outside, smooth and gray and flat, and he stopped. He stood on the sidewalk and stared at the stones, and the smell hit him. Not the real smell, not the smell of the stones, but the memory of the smell of the creek, the smell of the creature, the smell that was in his pores and his memory and would not wash out. He bought a stone. He took it home. He put it in the bathtub and turned on the water and scrubbed it with a toothbrush and bleach, and the sobbing came, not from grief this time but from the futility, from the impossibility of washing away something that wasn't on the stone but in him. He collected more stones, river stones, creek stones, any smooth gray stone that reminded him of the creek bed. He bought them from landscaping stores and garden centers and aquarium supply shops. He found them in parks and riverbanks and construction sites. He brought them home and scrubbed them, one by one, with bleach and a toothbrush, in the bathtub, sobbing, because the smell was in every stone and the smell was in him. And the scrubbing was a ritual that didn't work but that he couldn't stop because the ritual was the only thing he had, the only action that connected him to the experience and gave him the illusion of control. His therapist, Dr. Levine, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes and the patient, methodical manner of a person who has spent 30 years listening to things that don't make sense, called it OCD. She called it a trauma response. She called it an attempt to exert control over an experience that had stripped him of control. She prescribed SSRIs and cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy, gradually reducing the scrubbing, replacing the ritual with breathing exercises, redirecting the compulsion. Spencer listened to her and did the exercises and took the medication, and the scrubbing decreased, from 3 times a day to once, from once a day to once a week, from once a week to once a month. But it never stopped. It never went to 0, because the smell never went away. The smell was the anchor, the physical, sensory link to the creature, the proof that it had been real, that it had touched him, that the thing in the water was not a hallucination or a myth or a story but a fact, a biological fact, a thing that existed in the world and that had marked him. Nadia moved. She left Seattle, left her job, left her apartment, left her life, and went to live with her mother in Portland. She didn't call Spencer, she didn't call anyone. She sent one email 3 months after the trip that said, "I can still hear them. Leo, Maya, Dev, my mom, they're calling me. I know it's not real. I know it's the creature, but the knowing doesn't help. The knowing doesn't make the voices stop. I'm going to try to get better. I don't know if I can." Spencer read the email and didn't reply, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know what to say. He was in the same place. He could still hear the voices. He could still smell the smell. He knew it was the creature. The knowing didn't help. He thought about the guide's warning. If you hear someone you know calling from the tree line and that person is currently standing right next to you, do not look away from your friend. He had followed the warning. He had looked at Nadia and not looked away, and it had saved them both. But the warning had an implication that the guide hadn't stated. The warning implied that the creature was always there. Not in Alaska, not in the Tongass, here, in the city, in the apartment, in the space between the sounds. The creature didn't stay in the valley. The guide had said, "Do not look away from your friend." And the reason you shouldn't look away was that the creature was always trying to get between you and the people you trusted. It was always there, in the gaps, in the silence, in the space where a voice could be real or false, and you couldn't tell the difference. It didn't need to be in the water. It didn't need to be in the fog. It was in the echo. It was in the silt. It was in the space between the real voice and the false voice, in the moment of uncertainty where you couldn't tell whether the person calling your name was your friend or something that had eaten your friend and was wearing their voice. Spencer sat in his bathtub and scrubbed a river stone with bleach and a toothbrush and sobbed. And the smell of old fish rose from the stone and filled the bathroom and got into his pores and his clothes and the walls, and he knew, had always known, since the moment the creature had stood at the creek mouth and watched them go, that it hadn't let them go. It had released them. It had sent them out, back into the world, back into their lives, carrying the smell and the voices and the memory. Because the creature didn't just kill, it didn't just take, it planted seeds. It put itself in people, a fragment, an echo, a stain, and sent them back into the world where the stain would grow, where the echo would multiply, where the voices would call, and where someday, in some quiet moment, in some lonely hour, the person carrying the stain would hear the voice of someone they loved calling from a place that didn't exist, and they would go. They would go to the water. They would go to the creek. They would go back to the valley, to the fog, to the cannery, to the silt and the slime and the dark, cold water where the creature waited with the patience of a thing that had been alive for 1,000 years and would be alive for 1,000 more. They would go because the creature had put the wanting in them, the pull, the lure that was more real than reality, the voice that was more loving than love. They would go because the creature didn't need to follow them. It had made them into lures. It had turned them into echoes. And someday they would call someone else to the water and that person would go, and the cycle would continue, and the creek would never be empty. Spencer scrubbed the stone. The bleach ran between his fingers. The smell of old fish filled the bathroom. And somewhere far away in a valley in the Tongass National Forest, in a creek that ran through a narrow valley surrounded by trees so tall and so dense that they blocked the sky, a creature sat in the water and waited. It was patient. It had been patient for 1,000 years. It had all the time in the world, and it was listening. It was always listening. To the voices of the people who came to the valley, to the voices of the people who left, to the echoes that bounced and multiplied and spread through the world like ripples in silt-heavy water. It was listening, and it was waiting, and it was smiling, not with a mouth but with a sound, the sound of a voice that was more loving than love, calling from the water, calling from the fog, calling from the space between the real and the false. Calling, always calling. Come to the water, come to me, I'm here, I'm safe, come to the water. Come home. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.